Good afternoon. I welcome everyone to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Press Center. We have a traditional weekly briefing. We start with the schedule of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov. On April 18th, the Iranian Foreign Minister will be in Moscow on a working visit. He will hold talks with his Russian counterpart. The foreign minister will continue a thorough exchange of views on current international and regional issues, including the situation around the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Iranian nuclear program, the situation in Syria, Transcaucasia, and the Caspian Sea. The ministers also plan to discuss practical aspects of strengthening coordination of actions at the United Nations and other international platforms, including the SCO and BRICS, on the eve of the 18th meeting of the Permanent Russian-Iranian Commission on Trade and Economic Cooperation. It is scheduled for the 23rd–25th of April in Moscow. Particular attention is expected to be paid to the comprehensive consideration of issues of mutual trade, as well as the implementation of joint infrastructure projects in the field of transport and energy. And on April 21st, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is scheduled to participate in a meeting of the leadership of the Russian Strategic Vision Group Islamic World with the ambassadors of the member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, who are accredited in Moscow. During the meeting, the chairman of the Islamic World Strategic Management Group of Russia, the head of the Republic of Tatarstan, Rustam Minikhanov, will inform the ambassadors about the results of the group's work in the 24th year and the prospects for further activities, including within the framework of its regular meeting, under the slogan "The Experience of Russia and the Countries of the Islamic World in the Field of Youth Policy, Common Challenges, Joint Actions." Let me remind you that the event is scheduled for the 15th–16th of May in Kazan, on the sidelines of the International Economic Forum of Russia, Islamic World, Kazan Forum 25. In general, this event, the Kazan Forum, will be held from the 13th to the 18th of May. Representatives of federal and regional authorities, Russian religious associations, as well as academic and business circles, and, of course, the mass media are invited to meet. On April 21st, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will also meet with the Deputy Prime Minister of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, who will be in our country on a working visit. It is planned to discuss the state of prospects for the comprehensive promotion of bilateral relations, exchange views on ways to deepen political dialogue, expand trade and economic cooperation, and cultural and educational contacts. And in the period from the 22nd to the 23rd of April, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will pay an official visit to Uzbekistan. During his stay in Tashkent, a conversation with the President of the Republic of Uzbekistan is planned, as well as detailed negotiations with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of this country, and the main attention is supposed to be paid to the further development of bilateral comprehensive strategic partnership and alliance through the intensification of the implementation of agreements. Following the results of the state visit of the President of the Russian Federation Vladimir Putin to the Republic of Uzbekistan in May 2024 year, from the point of view of the coinciding or consonant approaches of Moscow and Tashkent, the parties will consider topical international issues of mutual interest, topics of regional security, interaction in the CIS, SCO, and Central Asia-Russia formats. The agenda includes issues and processes of Eurasian integration, taking into account Uzbekistan's observer status with the EU. One of the most important topics of the talks will, of course, be preparations for the celebration of the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War. The Russian Foreign Minister is scheduled to visit the Victory Park Memorial Complex in Tashkent. Among the key events of the program of the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry in the capital of Uzbekistan is a speech to the faculty and students of the University of World Economy and Diplomacy under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Uzbekistan. The visit of the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry is intended to give a tangible impetus to further building up the entire range of bilateral relations, joint work, and the coordinating role of foreign ministries in this process. We are coming to the current international agenda. The situation around Ukraine. Well, we once again state the Kiev regime's non-compliance with the 30-day moratorium on strikes on the fuel and energy complex. As you know and can see from the news, the Kiev regime continues to defiantly ignore the 30-day moratorium on strikes on energy facilities agreed on March 18th by the presidents of Russia and the United States, and, by the way, supported by Zelensky. The armed forces of Ukraine literally carry out daily raids with the help of drones on the infrastructure of the Russian fuel and energy complex. Since the so-called energy truce was announced, more than 80 such attacks have been recorded, I repeat, by the Kiev regime on the night of the 8th. Just a few examples. On the night of the 8th to the 9th of April, the UPU used 8 drones to attack an international energy facility located in the Korenevsky district of the Krasnodar territory, the Korenevskaya compressor station. Let me remind you that it provides gas supply to the Turkish Stream export gas pipeline. Its capacity is 31.5 billion cubic meters of gas per year. And as you know, the drones were shot down by air defense, but the fact that it was a planned, targeted attack by the Kiev regime on the fuel and energy complex is important. April 9th, 2 Ukrainian drones attacked a Temryuk gas distribution station. It provides gas supply to the city and the port of Temryuk. Both drones were destroyed. From the 10th to the 14th of April, high-voltage lines in the Belgorod, Bryansk, Zaporozhye, Kursk and Kherson regions, as well as in the Krasnodar territory and the LPR, were disconnected as a result of drone strikes of the armed forces of Ukraine and wire breakage. What were the goals of these Kiev regime drones? Transformers and electrical substations became the targets. It is part of the fuel and energy complex. The contact inset was damaged in the area of the railway station of the parent and North Caucasian Railway distribution steel gas pipeline of low pressure, GC Gazprom gas distribution Belgorod. This, I emphasize once again. A few examples. We have already transmitted all this data to the American side in the international organization, and we will continue to do so. But the crimes of the Kiev regime, as you know, extend not only to the fuel and energy complex. The Ukranazis continue to terrorize Russians. In fact, literally not that every day, hourly. Again, a few examples. This is necessary for those who believe or expect or ask questions about when and what should be done in order for the situation around Ukraine to be resolved. But, probably, to stop supporting the Kiev regime, which, in its terrorist frenzy, is doing what I'm going to say. On the 9th of April, as a result of the detonation of unexploded ammunition, 2 teenagers of 11 and 14 years old were killed in Donetsk. 2 civilians were injured from the dropping of explosives from a Ukrainian drone on a civilian car in Gorlovka and the residential quarter of Seladovo on the 10th and 14th of April, when an explosive object detonated on April 13th. A woman was injured in the village of Alexandrovo. On the same day, a HIMARS rocket attacked the Kiev district of Donetsk, damaged 7 civilian facilities, including a boarding school and 2 institutes. April 14th, as a result of drone attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine, 5 civilians were killed in the village of Zabuzhevka and the villages of Giri and Zolotarevka in the Kursk region. In the Belgorod region, only during the period from the 12th to the 14th of April, a truck driver was killed from attacks by Ukrainian drones. At least 5 civilians were injured. Again, on the 13th of April, the UFU fired from the NATO Mlos Vampire. What was fired at? Residential neighborhoods. Residential quarters of the cities of Kamenka, Dniprovskaya, Tokmak, Zaporozhye region. 3 private houses were destroyed. The Tokmak city administration building was damaged. Fortunately, this time there were no casualties, but after all, The strikes were purposefully inflicted on civilian objects, on civilian infrastructure, and, if we speak in everyday language, just elderly houses for housing. On the night of the 15th of April, the Ukrainists carried out a cynical terrorist attack against the civilian population of Kursk and the suburbs with the help of drones with striking elements. I repeat, the blows were aimed at elderly neighborhoods, at social facilities. According to local authorities, 24 apartment buildings were damaged. 3 of them are seriously damaged. Of the 9 injured, 6 were hospitalized. An elderly woman died. One of the blows was deliberately inflicted on the ambulance station. For those who should provide assistance, including the victims. 11 specialized ambulances were under this impact and received corresponding damage. Unless these drones were sent without understanding that they should cause damage to ambulances. Of course, all of this was manageable, and this is exactly how it was calculated, as a terrorist attack against the medical civilian infrastructure. And now I have a question for international organizations, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, his official representative, and numerous speakers and special envoys. I also have a question for those United Nations structures that, for example, deal with issues of childhood, motherhood, protection of socially vulnerable groups of the population, issues including medical support, and the safety of medical personnel. Where are your statements? Where are your concerns? Where are your press releases? Where are the words of sympathy, at least at briefings and press conferences? Where are the specialized briefings or interviews on this subject? There is nothing. You are not fulfilling your mandate well, gentlemen. All these atrocities are being investigated by Russian law enforcement agencies, and in particular, there are investigations of crimes of the armed forces of Ukraine against residents of the Kursk region. The investigative committee of our country continues to investigate the revealed facts of brutal killings by the armed forces of Ukraine, and, by the way, also by foreign mercenaries of residents of the Kursk region. In particular, surviving eyewitnesses from the village of Geva reported the shooting of 6 Russians by Bandera during their evacuation. They did not report the dumping of ammunition on residential buildings. They did not report widespread looting among the UFU militants. Evidence has been received that the chronicists threatened. Now is not for the faint of heart information. They threatened to rape a mother with many children in the village of Cossack Elbow, in the presence of her young children in front of her. The circumstances of the death of 9 residents of the village of Makhnovka, in the Sajinsky district, at the hands of the Ukrainists in March of this year, are being established. Gunshot wounds were found on 6 bodies. One of the victims is an elderly woman. The coronation Nazis just shot her in the head. This is only a small part of the atrocities committed. All those involved in the listed and other war crimes will be identified and brought to justice. Well, and about the favorite method of the Kiev regime and its Western curators in the next production. Do you remember how the entire so-called collective West has literally raised a ruckus over the last few days regarding the high-precision missile strike carried out by the Russian armed forces on April 13th of this year with a faded equipment at the venue of the meeting of the commanders of the UFU compound with the participation of Western instructors. All this gathering took place at the Magellan restaurant in Sumy. These Westerners all began to spin a propaganda fake, concocted in a hurry, but allegedly. How did the Kiev regime come up with their killing women and children with a Russian rocket? We have repeatedly commented on this topic, but it seems to me that a lot needs to be told about these things, so that everyone knows about the crime of the Kiev regime. Because, as we said, new facts are being revealed, confirming that this was a real production. Look, there is a huge amount of material on this subject in the Ukrainian segment of the Internet. In particular, the obituaries of the military who were liquidated on April 13th in Sums. The authorities, the Ukrainian authorities on the ground, reluctantly, but began to recognize the truth. The mayor of Konotop, Artem Semenikin, directly accused the head of the Sumy Regional Military Administration, Vladimir Artyukov, of organizing a meeting of the AFU militants with the involvement of women and children at this event, literally in order to use them as a human shield. Even the parliamentarians loyal to Zelensky, the so-called deputy of the Verkhovna Rada, Bezuglai, publicly demanded to figure out who invented and organized all this. Who ordered the use of Ukrainian women and children as a human shield for the event, directly by the military representatives of the armed forces of Ukraine and their curators. Why is this happening? Yes, because it seems to me that the citizens of Ukraine, no matter what political views they have, are beginning to realize that they were simply used. That the man who promised to bring them peace did not just bring them slaughter. He began to exterminate them. He began to maintain his power, not by democratic legal means, but by sacrificing the civilian population of his own country. Under the pressure of the facts, Zelensky had to dismiss the head of the Sumy military administration, this Artyuk. In fact, he thereby confirmed the charges against him. Thus, the leader of the junta tried to shift responsibility for this next terrible war crime, which was directed against his own citizens, to the head of the Sumy military administration. I remind Zelensky, who decided to shift the responsibility of his own Zelensky word to the head of the Sumy military administration. What did he say a couple of years ago? That he's not a sucker, Zelensky. And if so, then the responsibility is on him, definitely on it. Does he know, by the way, about what is happening now in Ukraine with these resignations, with the published obituaries of the Ukrainian military, with the use of civilians as a live account of a military gathering? The Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Gutierrez, after all, the day after the strike, and the targets were absolutely legitimate, he turned out to be, direct quote, alarmed by Russia's Sunday missile strike on the Sums. And after all, he also accused our country, again a direct quote, of attacking civilians. But now, when the facts have been revealed, as well as from the situation with the Bucha, when for 3 years there was not a single opportunity for anyone, including the Secretary General, to publish lists with the names of those allegedly killed there. Now, when it has once again been revealed that all this is staged, I am referring to all these stories of the Kiev regime, that Russia allegedly purposefully attacked civilian infrastructure, children and women. Now that everything has become clear, maybe after all someone will find the strength and ability of the United Nations Secretariat to tell and speak out on this matter. When the APU attacked civilians on the Crimean Bridge, when SBU terrorists blew up Russian journalists in the Moscow region, when drones attacked, including the Moscow Kremlin, when the APU punishers committed mass murders in the Kursk region, buried old people alive in the Russian River. All these supposedly Euro peacekeepers and international officials were silent, and the UN Secretariat diplomatically, remember, called for peace. Now, when the gathering of militants was liquidated, everyone began to accuse our country with one voice. And then, when it became obvious that in order to cover up this gathering, it was the Kiev regime, it was the local Ukrainian military administration that came up with this human shield, everyone somehow ran out of words abruptly. Yes, it's true. The Kiev regime decided to cover its ghouls with children. And they did it on purpose. And now all their curators and sponsors are covering it up. We also recorded the pathetic wax, these shouts, lamentations, that this blow was struck on Palm Sunday, a holy day for all Christians, and so on. It is only now that the international, this very world minority has taken care of the situation in Ukraine with the Orthodox, with the shrines, in general with Christianity. Just now, just this Palm Sunday, 2025th year. And before that, thousands of facts show that modern Ukrainian neo-Nazis have nothing sacred for a long time. I will focus only on the last aspect about the relationship stolen by the Bandera Church. We are literally on a daily basis, during briefings on a daily basis, but we are on this topic every day. All our ambassadors, representatives of international organizations, authorized representatives, we really talk every day and talk about how neo-Nazis abuse priests in Ukraine, how they desecrate churches, how they literally legitimize the abuse of shrines and relics. And what about the West, which has now remembered about the faithful Sunday among the Orthodox? Have you just now felt an insult to the feelings of believers? No way. Then we'll tell you what it's called. This is called criminal silence, what you have been performing for many years. The relevant human rights institutions and mechanisms of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Council on Freedom of Religion and Belief, the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, the personal representative of the OSCE Chairmanship and Office on Combating Intolerance and Discrimination, including Christians, are also criminally silent. Such connivance, the crime of Kiev neo-Nazis seizing Orthodox churches, organizing persecutions against believers up to physical, terrible reprisals, attacking clergy, is perceived by the Zelensky regime as encouragement, as literally goal-setting of the barbaric actions committed. But Russia is not silent. Our country collects facts and publishes relevant reports and specialized reviews. Let me remind you that 2 such reports have already been published about the illegal actions of the Kiev regime against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the clergymen and parishioners. This report was published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia in July of the 23rd year, and in January of the 25th, the second report was released. The links will definitely be placed in the text of today's briefing. These reports are available in English. They are distributed in international organizations. I have not seen any real reaction of the collective West to these facts. Maybe now all those who remembered Palm Sunday will find a couple of hours to get acquainted with these reports. They are written entirely on the basis of facts. But all these crimes of the Ukranazis will be investigated, and they will be punished for them, which is what is happening now. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for their war crimes and other crimes. Zavitsky, the commander of a separate engineer-sapper platoon of the Afu Marine Infantry Battalion, was sentenced to 24.5 years in a high-security penal colony in absentia. In March of the 22nd year, he shot a civilian with machine guns on the territory of the Mariupol Metallurgical Combine. Together with a colleague, a sentence was passed in absentia to a citizen of Ukraine, Panovsky. In January 2000 of the 19th year, he attacked the General Consulate of Russia in Odessa. Then, if you remember, cans of paint and 5 smoke bombs were thrown on the territory of our foreign institution. The offender was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He is on the international wanted list. Nicholas Chai and Taro Levi-Kovisto, who fought on the side of high earners from Brazil and Finland, were sentenced to 7 to 14 years in prison in absentia. Georgian so-called legionnaire Georgy Gagauzia received 9 years of imprisonment in person. He was captured by Russian servicemen in November of the 23rd year on the territory of the LPR. A militant from the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Nikolenko, previously detained by Russian servicemen, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. During the illegal invasion of the territory of the Kursk region, he intimidated local residents and prevented their evacuation, as well as repeatedly opened fire on civilians and Russian servicemen. But it is examples. We will bring this information further and further. And of course, my favorite meme is a coalition of willing. Her next meeting in Brussels on the 10th of April, she was. The truth about the coalition of those who want a breakthrough did not happen. Apparently, they are not as willing as they write about it. Despite all efforts, Paris and London still cannot achieve unity of support for the insane plan they are promoting to deploy in Ukraine, as they have formulated it, a multinational peacekeeping contingent consisting of a unit of a number of NATO member countries. Judging by the media information, only the same rabid Russophobes from the Baltic states, I mean, of course, the regimes, are ready to join this adventure, which is fraught with a direct clash of the alliance with Russia, in addition to the French and the British. The countries and peoples themselves often simply do not even know what those who are in power in their countries are doing there. Most of the participants in the so-called coalition doubt the realism of this military intervention without the support of the United States. Washington is still not going, judging by the statements, to get involved in such an adventure. In general, it seems realistic, understanding what all this will lead to. Well, the Ramstein format, the 27th meeting has already taken place on the 11th of April at the NATO headquarters under the British-German chairmanship. This is the 27th meeting of the contact group on defense assistance, as they write, to Ukraine in the Ramstein format. It is the first time it has been held now without the personal presence of the head of the Pentagon. Zelensky joined the participants on the VIX, and no fresh innovative decisions were made. 21 billion euros were promised to be allocated for the necessary APU. This figure was previously voiced in NATO statements. London was marked again. He announced an aid package of £350 million and includes this package, as it was said, hundreds of thousands of drones, radar systems, and so on. In total, in the 25th year, the British are going to spend £4.5 billion on military aid to Kiev. They try to keep up with them. 30 additional missiles for Patriot installations have already been shipped to Berlin, Ukraine, but Berlin cannot transmit the American systems themselves, as you know. In return, Germany is ready to allocate 4 more anti-aircraft missiles of the ISTI complex and supply combat vehicles, tanks, ammunition, and so on. In total, Germany plans to allocate about 3 billion euros for these purposes. Where do you think they'll get them from? Of course, from the pockets of their taxpayers, who, without this, are under the yoke of the madness of the decisions of both the previous and current German authorities. The co-chairs from Germany announced the creation of another, 9th in a row, another mem, of the coalition of opportunities under their leadership. Can you imagine, just like in a joke, there is a coalition of willing, and there is a coalition of opportunities. This time, they will gather on radar warfare issues, and 11 countries will enter it. It will be designed to ensure the reliability of Ukrainian communication systems, the suppression of communications of Russian units, and, as it was said, protection from drones. In general, this gathering, although it confirmed that the Essevites are set up for further military assistance to the Kiev regime, but there is obviously uncertainty, if not loss, in their behavior. The growing detachment of the United States from further participation in this wild process is affecting, and Europe has clearly forgotten how to act independently without looking back at Washington. And then the most important thing, because it will be necessary to bear sole responsibility for this, and, of course, it is very interesting against this background that the German report on, as it was formulated there, a significant drawback of weapons, the contents of a certain review, which was released by the deputy military attaché at the German embassy in Kiev, with an analysis, again, as it is formulated there, of the significant shortcomings of weapons transferred by Berlin to the needs of the armed forces, became public to Germany. Among the key problems mentioned are the complexity of operation, for malfunctions, time-consuming repairs, high cost and lack of ammunition, as well as interruptions with spare parts, and then on the little things. It is concluded that at the current stage, almost no sample of German-made heavy weapons is fully suitable for active use during intensive combat operations. Such facts, it seems to me, give reason to seriously think about Berlin's ability to be one of the main and, as they claim, reliable suppliers of weapons to Ukraine. And this is the same country that, as I have already said, participates in Ramstein formats, invents new formats of the coalition of opportunities, puts together some kind of defense-offensive alliances, and so on. And, by the way, all these doubts only increase if we recall that earlier the head of the German Ministry of Defense, Pistorius, complained, it was publicly in the media, about the shortage of his own stocks of weapons from his incessant supplies to the Kiev regime. And, of course, the involvement of the British here needs to be said. We drew attention to the publication of facts to the English editions of the Times on April 11th, which confirm the high degree of involvement of London in the conflict in Ukraine. Among other things, it is claimed that already in February of the 22nd year, almost dozens of British servicemen were sent to Kiev to instruct the AFU militants on the management of anti-tank complexes supplied by London. It is also noted that in May of the 23rd year, after the transfer of long-range Storm Shadow missiles to the Kiev regime, British military specialists were secretly transported to Ukraine to equip aircraft with them and train Ukrainians to use them. Moreover, as you know, the failed counteroffensive of the armed forces of Ukraine, which failed in the summer of 2023 year, was named after the then Minister of Defense of Albion, Ben Wallace. What does this indicate? This clearly shows who in reality is involved in the development of military plans and the conduct of combat operations of the Kiev regime. Here is another proof that, of course, we are not talking about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. We are talking about a hybrid war. It is called the Collective West, the NATO countries, the Western minority against our country, by the hands of Ukraine. I would like to recall the events of 11 years ago, because 11 years ago, on these days, on April 13th, 2014, the National Security Council of Ukraine decided on, as it was said, urgent measures to overcome the terrorist threat and preserve the territorial integrity of Ukraine. All of this was put into effect the next day by decree of acting President Turchinov. What was it in simple terms? And, as a matter of fact, this is how the infamous, or else it is called an anti-terrorist operation, began. In fact, the civil war of the neo-Nazi regime was launched against its own compatriots in the Donbass at that time, who did not accept the so-called government of the victors, realizing that this was a neo-Nazi government that seized power in the country as a result of the bloody putsch in Kiev in February of the same year, and which unceremoniously began to destroy not just dissent, but everything that, like their predecessors 80 years ago, did not consider worthy of being called the first grade. This name was used exclusively to present the Kiev regime as a victim. But this is, as always, another staging. However, by declaring an anti-terrorist operation, the Kiev regime itself switched to a policy of state terrorism, in addition to the constant shelling and bombing of Donbass. Remember, at that time a severe economic, energy, financial, transport, and water blockade was imposed against the region. And since December 2000 of the 14th year, the government of Ukraine has stopped paying all social benefits to the residents of Donbass, including pensions, servicing the accounts of the population and enterprises by banks, and full-fledged food supplies have been hampered, and of course, the water supply of cities and towns was regularly cut off. And all these years, Russia has constantly tried to attract the attention of the international community, but it did it not only politically, because Russia supplied humanitarian aid, and just regularly or constantly, on a daily basis. Remember how these deliveries of humanitarian aid were perceived in the West. I remember very well when those huge white trucks that started delivering everything that saved, and as a result, saved the residents of Donbass. It was clothes, food and medicines, and of course, mobile power units in order to simply heat their homes. The West has shouted that it is, as they said then, I remember very well, and there is an invasion. Then they really started to play back, but it was too late, because everyone realized that this was another fake of the Western media. What they just did not come up with, that allegedly in these trucks and tanks, and some kind of weapons, almost personnel, it was humanitarian aid, and it probably would not have been needed if the Kiev regime had not conducted the blockade, which we talked about regularly, and which I recalled today. Against the background of literally daily humanitarian aid being collected and delivered to the region, we tried to draw the attention of the international community to what was happening in the Donbass. It was openly said that the Kiev regime was pursuing a deliberate course of extermination of ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking residents of the region. Yes, we started calling things by their proper names then. They said that the Donbass was accused of terrorism. This is a gross fake. On January 31st of the 24th year, this was confirmed by the International Court of Justice, which by its decision refused to recognize the DPI and the LPR, as the Kiev regime formulated it, as terrorist organizations, and the International Court of Justice of the United Nations also refused to recognize Russia, again, as the Kiev regime insisted for many years, as a sponsor of terrorism. This verdict refuted Kiev's main argument in justifying the war it unleashed against the civilian population and confirmed that all the actions of the Kiev regime against Donbass were initially based on an outrageous lie. Every year on the 14th of April, our people pay tribute to the memory of the victims of the Ukrainian aggression. And we are grateful to everyone who today continues to fight the Nazi evil spirits that have come to our land and protects people, and does everything so that there is a peaceful sky over their heads. The listed facts, there are a lot of them, because we give only examples, but even they once again confirm the relevance of a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and eliminate threats emanating from its territory. As the Russian leadership has repeatedly stated, all of them will definitely be fulfilled. By the way, let's take a closer look at the international reaction. We have done this repeatedly again, but today we need to repeat it again and draw attention to the fact that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, demonstrates behavior incompatible with the status of a high-ranking unofficial. He also demonstrates a departure from the principles of objectivity and impartiality, which is the basis of his mandate, which was, again, this mandate established by the UN General Assembly Resolution 41 Fraction 148. The practice of double standards has become a distinctive feature of the work of the department headed by him. It prefers not to notice the obvious systemic, gross violations of human rights in Western countries and their allies. However, the reaction of the Ionian functionaries to any events, often absolutely unconfirmed, which then turn out to be false facts, in states they do not like, I mean those they do not like for the West, does not take long. And a vivid example of such a policy, in the activities of the High Commissioner, is the approaches to assessing the situation in Ukraine, where there is a large-scale violation of human rights by the Kiev regime, and the problem of multiple discrimination of the Russian-speaking population continues to remain outside the sphere of interests of the High Commissioner for many years. The use of the Russian language is de facto prohibited, and everyone already knows about it in all spheres of life in Ukraine, and those who dare to speak their native language face fines, administrative prosecution, threats from neo-Nazis, up to physical violence on their part. And Volker Turk, a bright champion of civil rights, does not cause any concern or surprise. The situation with freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and association in Ukraine, where the political public space has been literally cleared of opposition parties, objectionable mass media, and civil society organizations. In general, in principle, there is no condemnation from the High Commissioner, trampling on the rights of believers as a result of the brazen Zelensky regime, literally war, to exterminate the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is accompanied by arson, vandalism. Expropriation doesn't fit that word. Expropriation has at least some basis, except for this misanthropic frenzy. Here, temples, churches, monasteries are simply torn out of the hands of believers, forcibly seize, threaten, physically threaten. All of this applies both to representatives of the clergy and to parishioners. The long-term disregard by high unofficials of the systematic and malicious violation of fundamental human rights by the Zelensky regime, the rampant neo-Nazism and Russophobia in Ukraine has led to the fact that the Kiev junta violates the norms of international humanitarian law with the same ease. The Ukrainian armed formations use civilians as hostages, human shields, subject them to targeted shelling, torture, kill Russian prisoners of war and civilians. Here, recently, we have been talking about it all the time, the atrocities, the real atrocities of Ukrainian neo-Nazis against the residents of Seladov DNR, the Russian region, that Kursk region. Those who have seen these shots live differently. It's impossible to look at it. I talked to representatives of our law enforcement agencies. They warn us every time they send us materials. It's simply impossible to look at it indifferently. Other territories that were under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine, there are the same terrible crimes. All this only confirms that the office of the High Representative of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights under the rule of Volker Turk has broken down, something has gone wrong, and now it is not fully functioning. Apparently, we will not wait for an adequate reaction of the High Commissioner to the death of Russian journalists. These are not isolated examples. These are already mass cases, when employees of the Russian media are killed as a result of attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine, as it was in June of the 24th year, and in March of the 25th year, when they were blown up among peaceful cities. He also cynically bypasses attention. The purposeful policy of discrimination on national, ethnic, racial, religious, linguistic grounds, carried out in the Baltic states, continues. Let me remind you that in these countries, ethnic Russians continue to be persecuted and expelled under far-fetched pretexts. They consider these countries their homeland. Someone was born there, someone lived there all his life, someone worked for the benefit of these countries. They have found families, they are raising children, grandchildren. The latest example of such denial of reality on the part of Volker Turk is, of course, the legislative initiative to ban the Estonian Orthodox Church. Under what pretext was this done? The chickens laugh. Threats to national security. It turns out that this is what orthodoxy is for the Estonian authorities. It was with the connivance, including of this institution, that the absurd bill destroying the rights of believers, not violating, but destroying, was recently adopted. As it turned out, the high-profile statements of the High Commissioner upon taking office. We remember very well the commitment to the principles of objectivity, impartiality, independence in the conduct of their activities. It doesn't cost anything. The continuation of this situation will inevitably lead to the final loss of confidence of the international community in the institution of the High Commissioner and the office headed by him, and this, in turn, will significantly weaken the scope of international cooperation in the field of human rights. The activities of the High Commissioner and this institution as a whole should be aimed at encouraging dialogue, cooperation, and real assistance, and not at inciting distrust and confrontation. The situation in Moldova, it causes serious concern, especially in connection with what is happening around the autonomous territorial entity of Gagauzia within the Republic of Moldova. Recently, the Moldovan authorities have been actively trying to dismantle the autonomous status of this region. As you know, on March 25th, its head Yevgeny Hutsulin was detained under an obviously far-fetched pretext and is currently under house arrest. 3 days ago, on April 14th, the Constitutional Court of Moldova declared, as they put it, unconstitutional Article 21 of the law on the special status of Gagauzia. When was it adopted? In 1994. It secured the right of its parliament to participate in the appointment of the prosecutor of the autonomy. Now his candidacy will be approved by the Supreme Council of Prosecutors of Moldova and the Prosecutor General in Chisinau. Of course, this is a politically motivated court decision, and of course, it was developed and adopted in private, and the representatives of the Kamrad were not informed in advance about the upcoming meeting on such a sensitive issue for them. Can you imagine? That's what's going on. Another example of the so-called concern of Chisinau Gagauz was introduced on April 10th. The procedure for levying fabulous fines from residents of the autonomy for receiving social payments through the Russian Promsvyaz Bank. Hypocrisy is also manifested in the fact that those who conducted this practice themselves exist on grants from Western foundations, and often are simply citizens of other states. The maxims of certain functionaries in Chisinau unequivocally indicate the intention to literally reduce the status of dissident Gagauzia to other Moldovan regions, and leave these areas of autonomy, these elements of autonomy, only in the field of culture. We will not be surprised if the next step of the Moldovan leadership is to restrict the electoral rights of Gagauz people, who can currently organize elections on their own. Apparently, there will be some kind of mark, something. Here are 80-odd years. 80-90 years ago, The same ideologists introduced special identification signs for the wrong kind of people on the territory of Western Europe. For example, there were yellow stars of David. They smeared the windows with paint on ethnic grounds. Then, they forced people into the ghetto, where they were recommended to stay. Then you know what happened. Then there were no ghettos, and then there were gas chambers. This is how Romanian citizens who have settled in Chisinau will behave with Gagauz people. We strongly condemn the totalitarian methods of the Moldovan authorities used against Gagauzia and call on the profile of the international structure to pay attention to the blatant violation of human rights and national minorities, and force Chisinau to stop strangling the Gagauz people. After all this is happening in the center of the European continent, precisely in that part of it that, under the tutelage of Western European statesmen and public figures, cares so much about human rights. And here is Estonia. On the 14th of April, amendments to the legislation came into force there, according to which local naval forces are given the right to use force against foreign vessels. They can, this is a direct quote, intercept, redirect, or otherwise force civilian vessels to change course, and, if necessary, even sink them. These powers apply to the maritime zone of Estonia, which includes internal sea waters, territorial sea, and exclusively the economic zone of the country, which according to international law does not belong to the territory of a coastal state. Russia strongly condemns these. And let's call it all again in our own words. Pirate habits, since the powers that are presented to the Estonian Navy go beyond the framework of international law, including the Unconvention on the Law of the Sea of 1982, which are universal, let me remind you, in nature. And there is a malicious decision of Tallinn, which violates the spirit and letter of international law. If actions are directed against Russian vessels, our country will react in proportion to the risk and threats posed by Estonia as a NATO member state. The Russian side emphasizes that the Baltic Sea is a common water area for all coastal countries. We expect that all countries that follow international law in practice, and not in words, will give an objective assessment of Tallinn's provocative decision, which creates significant risks for shipping to the Baltic and security in the region. Well, and also from the lawlessness of the Estonian. A bill on amendments to the Constitution of Estonia was recently approved there, in order to deprive Russian citizens permanently residing in the country of the right to vote in municipal elections in the autumn of this year. At the same time, no one remembers that we are talking about people who work in factories, regularly pay taxes, make a full contribution to the welfare of this very country, Estonia. They faithfully fulfill all their civil obligations, and they are for it, exactly so it sounds. It is for this that they are deprived of their rights, only because they are of a different nationality, because they are Russian. This is racism that has turned into neo-Nazism in its purest form. Pushing through this discriminatory initiative is the desire of local Russophobes, not only to deprive a significant part of Russian-speaking residents of Estonia, I emphasize once again, of their legal rights, but also to manipulate the voting results in the grossest way. The exclusion of tens of thousands of Russians from the voter list, and since the 26th year, stateless persons, will play into the hands of nationalist-minded forces and significantly reduce the level of support for parties that traditionally defend the interests of Russian-speaking residents. It is noteworthy that the initiators of the innovations ignored the calls of the Chancellor on the issues of Estonian law to carefully analyze their consequences. And why? If there is this Russophobic, nationalistic, neo-Nazi frenzy, They did not accept her conclusion that there was no connection between national security and the solution of local self-government issues. In addition, criticism of the authors of the constitution, the Estonian Lawyers' Union, the mayors of Tallinn and Narva went unnoticed, and most of the Russian-speaking residents of this country live there. Everything is ignored. Everything was ignored. Nobody is interested in anything. There is an order. There is a plan to implement Russophobia. Apparently they are on the schedule. With their next extraordinary step, the Estonian authorities violate in general, all relevant international obligations in the field of human rights protection, including those they have accepted absolutely voluntarily through the United Nations and the OSCE. We will seek firm authorized international structures to condemn this frankly Russian venture. On April 9th, the official opening of the BRICS Industrial Competence Center, on the basis of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization UNIDO, took place in Vienna. The event was attended by Deputy Minister of Industry and Trade of our country, Alexei Gruzdov. Director General of the international structure mentioned, Herb Muller, representative of the BRICS and CIS countries, and the initiative to create the center was put forward by Russia and supported by all participants of the association, and this, accordingly, was reflected in the Kazan Declaration of the BRICS Summit of the 24th year. The center will become a full-format platform for the systematic selection and implementation of promising technologies, dissemination of best practices, and professional development of personnel in the field of industrial production. The center's task is to develop international technological cooperation, search for partners, exchange of practices, convergence of standards, support for small and medium-sized companies, and this fully corresponds to the goals of the aforementioned international organization. We hope that the work of the center will increase the effectiveness of the coordination of the association state on the industrial track and will help attract additional investments to provide practical support to interested countries. By the way, there is also a whole block related to how the West actually treats human rights and its international legal obligations in this area. April 11th, the Finnish parliament has unanimously approved a law that prohibits the acquisition of real estate in Finland by citizens of states that, this quote, violate the territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence of other countries, pose a threat to national security in Finland, and may also improperly use their citizens to the detriment of Finland's security. You know, like a children's movie, What's His Name? You could probably find out from this description. Well, for example, Biden's Washington. Maybe these are Biden's predecessors. I don't know. Presidents Bush Sr., Jr., who, as it says, violate the territorial integrity and sovereignty or independence of other countries. Maybe Clinton, under whom so much has been done in Europe improperly to violate the territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence of countries. Serbia has a lot to say on this score. Who are you describing? Question to the Finnish parliament. In fact, despite the obvious characteristics of their now so-called NATO partners, where the Finns, I mean the citizens of this country, were literally tricked into, despite the fact that all these characteristics are similar and coincide with the description of the activities of NATO members, but it means Russia. After the entry into force of this law, the Finnish government intends to submit a list, quote, of states threatening this country, but honestly, I suggest they start with the NATO states. Of course, our country and our citizens are not directly mentioned in this document, but we understand perfectly well, against the background of this hysterical anti-Russian Russophobic rhetoric, who are we talking about? I think it is also obvious to everyone that the authors of the document are not at all embarrassed by its discriminatory, even segregational nature. And, by the way, many people also tried to ask Finland a question at the stage of consideration of this draft. This document had so many complaints, there were so many discussions on the part of Finnish human rights organizations. Absolutely none of this was taken into account. Moreover, the absolute inventiveness or attraction of the story about threats emanating from ordinary citizens of certain foreign countries, the unpredictable growth of distrust in the Finnish legal system with its adoption. Again, none of this could slow down the Russophobic-minded community of Finland from adopting this crazy, strange, wild law. In the absurd, but obviously desirable goal of causing maximum damage to bilateral relations, or to our country, our citizens, apparently, all means are good for these befuddled Russophobes of Finnish lawmakers. And, apparently, this approach is supported by a certain part of the Finnish elite. But I say it again, because these complaints during the discussion of the bill primarily came from indigenous Finnish citizens. Who listens to them? Nobody, and we will take into account similar steps in Finland and official Helsinki. And of course about one topic, which, unfortunately, does not leave us. During the meeting of the 221st session of the UNESCO Half Council, which is ending in Paris, the topic of protecting the safety of journalists was again resonantly voiced, namely, how the organization's leadership acts, or better to say, does not act in this direction. As you know, as you remember, we have repeatedly indicated our determination to seek from UNESCO Director General Azula, while she has not yet resigned, the faithful fulfillment of her mandate. Our consistent line, including at the Executive Council, is bearing fruit. Serious problems, shortcomings, or deliberate evasion of the head of the Secretariat from the full implementation of the instructions of the legislative bodies of organizations have already been noted by many countries. The heated debates around this agenda item for the events clearly demonstrated that the delegation's disagreements about the line being pursued by the UNESCO Secretariat on the track of ensuring, and I want to say it better again, I still use the word not ensuring the safety of journalists, acquire the character of fundamental ones. It is especially noticeable against the background of last year's scandalous report on Zula on this topic, in which there was no place, apparently, they saved on paper for mentioning Russian journalists, employees of Russian mass media, who died at the hands of militants of the Kiev regime in the period from the 22nd to the 23rd years. And many are now asking a fair question: why there have been no drastic changes since that time. At the same time, the main claims of the speakers, primarily from the countries of the world majority, to the work of the UNESCO Secretariat, concerned the use of non-transparent methodologies for collecting data on dead journalists, according to which priority is still given to information and opinions coming from Western NGOs. And you understand perfectly well that they do not suffer from any objectivity. And these data should be collected, well, probably first of all from UNESCO state members. No one disputes that non-governmental organizations should and can take part in this, of course. But first of all, official information should be received, and not biased and paid for by such structures as, for example, this scandalous American Agency for International Development, which paid for orders including similar NGOs. It is significant that only some Western countries have come out in defense of the methodology, which is not based on the opposition and the will of the member countries. The Russian delegation reiterated the unacceptability of such a selective approach of Director General solely to the implementation of the decisions of the General Conference from the Half Council. And they, let me remind you, ordered to condemn the murder of media employees without any distinction. The Russian delegation also pointed out that it was impossible to consider its report as a reliable and exhaustive source of information about the deceased media employees, media workers. The Russian side also rejected the legitimacy of a certain methodology used by the UNESCO Secretariat. These differences and confrontations in approaches from the Half Council were expressed in particular in the fact that the draft decision of this UNESCO body on the safety of journalists was adopted not by consensus, as in previous years, but by voting. And all this has become another eloquent evidence that the deliberate politicization, Ukrainization of the activities of this universal organization by its secretariat, by the way, by the Director General of Azul, leads to undermining the mechanisms of collegial decision-making on this platform, and hits unity and authority, as well as literally poisons the atmosphere of interstate dialogue on generally significant, unprivatized by any one state issues on the global agenda. We hope that the future leadership of UNESCO, which will replace the scandalous Azula, should be replaced this fall, will apply fundamentally different approaches to the performance of their official duties, basing them on the principles of impartiality, equal remoteness, integrity, as prescribed by the UNESCO Charter. As you know, at every briefing we talk about the events of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, about the heroes of the Red Army, about the most important battles, about the attempts of Russophobes to distort the past, to denigrate the Soviet soldiers' liberators. We are talking about vandalism against monuments and graves in Europe. You know, sometimes an impression can form. By the way, for many, it probably turns out that Ukraine has allegedly already joined the European Union, but only in a specific, brown-tinged European Union. The European Union of grave desecrators, the European Union of revanchists, revisionists of the history of the Second World War, lawyers of the Third Reich, to the European Union, glorifying the bloody executioners and collaborators who destroyed millions of civilians in Europe. Probably, Ukraine has already joined this European Union better than the Kiev regime. And we remember the millions of our victims. And in a few days, on the 19th of April, a day of unified actions will be held throughout the country in memory of the genocide of the Soviet people by the Nazis and their accomplices during the Great Patriotic War. Events are held in schools, universities, institutions of science, culture, regional and municipal institutions. And every year, the number of participants is steadily growing. This reflects the importance of this topic for our people. This day was not chosen by chance, because it was on the 19th of April, 1943, that the Decree Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR No. 39 was issued, on punishments for German fascist villains guilty of murder and torture of the Soviet civilian population, and captured Red Army soldiers, for spies, traitors to the motherland from among Soviet citizens, and for their accomplices." End quote. I quoted the official title of the document 1943rd year on April 19th. The appearance of this document was the first recognition of the purposeful and large-scale policy of the Nazis and their accomplices to destroy the civilian population in the occupied territory and the punishability of such crimes. Since 2021 year, actions in memory of the victims of the genocide have been held within the framework of the project without a statute of limitations, and we regularly talk about it too. We are also talking about cooperation with the National Center of Historical Memory under the President of the Russian Federation, which is now leading this project, and for its part, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, together with the competent departments, including the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation, is systematically working to consolidate the qualification of the crimes of the Nazi invaders during the Great Patriotic War as genocide of the peoples of the Soviet Union. In conditions of serious confrontation with the West, this work requires considerable effort, but we must continue to tell the truth. And in this, we are supported by like-minded people. The statement of the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the STO member states, on the 75th anniversary of the verdict of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, adopted in Dushanbe on the initiative of Russia on May 19, 2021, emphasizes that the facts of expulsion and extermination by the Nazis, as well as accomplices of the civilian population of the Soviet Union, established in the verdict of the Nuremberg Tribunal, should be regarded as genocide of the peoples of the Soviet Union. A similar statement is included in the statement of the heads of the CIS member states in connection with the 30th anniversary of the Commonwealth. This document was adopted on the 15th of October of the 21st year. Both statements have been distributed as official documents of the United Nations General Assembly, and we will duplicate the links in the text of today's briefing, and we pay priority attention to the further promotion and specification of the provisions on the genocide of the peoples of the USSR contained in these documents. In 2023 year, a statement was adopted by the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation on the genocide of the peoples of the Soviet Union by Germany and its accomplices during the Great Patriotic War of 1941–1945 years. On April 16th, the Federation Council approved the federal law on perpetuating the memory of the victims of the genocide of the Soviet people during the Great Patriotic War of 1941–1945 years, and adopted an appeal to foreign parliaments of foreign states and peoples of the world on the inadmissibility of falsifying the history of the Second World War and the rehabilitation of Nazism. Of fundamental importance to us is the recognition by the world community of the crimes committed by the Nazis on the territory of the Soviet Union during the Great Patriotic War as genocide of the peoples of the Soviet Union. Joint work with our CIS partners on international platforms is subordinated to this goal. The leaders of the Commonwealth countries adopted an appeal to the peoples of the CIS states and the world community in connection with the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War. The document states that the direct quote, "The facts of the expulsion, extermination of civilians by the Nazis and their accomplices, established in the verdict of the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, should be regarded as genocide of the peoples of the Soviet Union." End quote. This thesis is also confirmed by the Stowe Declaration. We are working tirelessly to ensure that all the facts discovered by the investigative committee of our country and recognized by the Russian judicial authorities are fully communicated to the world community in the name of protecting historical truth and perpetuating the memory of millions of our innocent citizens who fell victims to Nazism and misanthropic ideology. A few more dates in international relations. The 17th of April, 1975th year, is a tragic date in the history of Cambodia. On this day, the armed units of the Red Mariers seized the stump, after which the Pol Pot and its supporters began to build the so-called Democratic Kampuchea. Already at the end of April, 3.5 million citizens were forcibly relocated to rural areas, where they had to do the most laborious work, clearing the jungle for new fields, restoring and rebuilding irrigation facilities. Everyone who did not fit into the new political system was mercilessly destroyed. Representatives of the old government, the national bourgeoisie, intellectuals, clergy, Buddhist monks, were subjected to the most severe repressions. The genocide of the national minorities living in the country, namely the Vietnamese and the Chams professing Islam, was carried out. Mass executions, chronic hunger, a complete lack of medical care, let me remind you, doctors and hospitals were simply destroyed, led to numerous human casualties. According to various estimates, from 1.5 to 2 million people died during the reign of the Red Measures. After the fall of Pol Pot's regime in 1979 year, his supporters, who settled in refugee camps in Thailand, were under close attention, of course, from the West and Washington in particular, primarily his allies. They received not only financial and material assistance, but also diplomatic support. It was thanks to the efforts of the West that the Cambodians occupied the Cambodian place in the United Nations until 1982, after which it passed for many years to the so-called coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea, in which the Khmer Rouge played a leading role. Another significant date is the 19th of April. It is celebrated on this day 80 years since diplomatic relations were established between the USSR and the Republic of Guatemala. This is a long time, but the first contacts between the two countries, of course, were established much earlier. Back in 1880, the Russian Emperor Alexander II and Guatemalan President Justo Finabarius Aún exchanged messages. They were the beginning of our bilateral relations. This was a step that allowed us to form strong bonds of friendship and mutual understanding, and lay the foundations for fruitful multidisciplinary cooperation. We believe that the potential accumulated over the past decades should be strengthened and multiplied. We confirm our unwavering commitment to developing a constructive political dialogue with the TOE, expanding the legal framework of bilateral relations, and diversifying trade, economic, cultural, and humanitarian ties between our countries on the basis of pragmatism, mutual respect, and equality. We congratulate our Guatemalan colleagues and friends on this significant date. Another announcement. From the 17th to the 24th of April, the next 47th Moscow International Film Festival will be held in Moscow. This year, it will be attended by representatives of 50 countries. 1,600 applications were submitted. This is, well, speaking as a percentage, though. It seems to me that everyone understands that the Moscow Film Festival is a world historical brand. But if you need numbers, we also have them. This is a 17% increase compared to last year. This indicates the growing interest in this event among cinematographers around the world. The largest number of films came from Russia, China, Spain, France, and Iran. The program demonstrates a wide range of topics that concern humanity. It is important that one of the main topics, of course, was the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War. It was reflected in various viewing programs. The film is also dedicated to this topic. The opening of the festival will be a military picture of Sergei Koroteyev with Vladimir Mashkov, Vladislav Miller, Alyona Marilova in the main roles. This is a historical film about courage, faith, and love for the motherland, based on the novel of the same name by Boris Vasiliev. The Moscow International Film Festival promotes the establishment of cooperation between cinematographers around the world, the popularization of creative achievements of Russian foreign cinematography, and, in general, the development of international cultural ties and the strengthening of mutual understanding between peoples. Well, and an important date in the life of domestic foreign policy. The 19th of April marks 180 years since the birth of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Empire, Count Mikhail Nikolaevich Muravyov. His brilliant diplomatic career began in May of 1864 year with the post of junior secretary for the Russian mission in Berlin. Over the next 30 years, foreign missions followed in Stockholm, Stuttgart, The Hague, and Paris. At the beginning of the Russian-Turkish War, this is 1878th year. The young diplomat was in the theater of operations as one of the commissioners of the Red Cross, and, according to the statement of the command, showed himself in the most worthy way. From 1893 to 1897, he held the post of envoy extraordinary and authorized minister in Copenhagen. On January 1st, 1897, Nicholas II appointed Muravyov as the manager of the foreign ministry, and 3 months later as its head. The period from 1897 to 1900 years. This period was marked by events that were of great international importance. Russia pursued an active foreign policy in the Far East, concluded an agreement with Austria on the status and the UN in the Balkans. In 1898 year, for the first time in the history of international relations, the Russian Foreign Ministry took the initiative to convene a conference on arms reduction. Russia's foreign policy in the Near and Middle East has been activated. This led to the establishment of direct contacts with Afghanistan, the strengthening of Russian positions in Iran and Turkey. The minister's visit to this country in 1897 year contributed to the strengthening of ties with France. I will quote, "Do not be surprised. I will quote a phrase directly from the document in a detailed, all-inclusive report. On the document, there is such a mark of Nicholas II. I read it with great pleasure. I emphasize that Muravyov's talks in the French capital were successful and helped to strengthen mutual understanding between the two powers regarding the containment of Germany and England on the European continent. Mikhail Nikolaevich went down in history as one of the main initiators of the Russian-Chinese Convention of 1898 year on the lease of Port Arthur to Russia, the port of Dalny, on the Kwantung-Liaodin Peninsula. On April 28, 1899, with his participation, an agreement was concluded with Britain on heating up the spheres of railway construction in China. It secured for Russia the right to preserve the railways in Manchuria, Outer and Mongolia, as well as the line from the Chinese Eastern Railway to Beijing. During the years of Muravyov's leadership of the Foreign Ministry, Russia expanded its ties with many states. In 1897 year, an official representative was sent to Abyssinia. The mission in Washington was transformed into an embassy. New consulates were established in Iran, Morocco. Mikhail Nikolaevich Muravyov died on the 21st of June, 1900th year in St. Petersburg. The documents of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia noted that the direct quote, "The sudden death of the Minister of Foreign Affairs caused a feeling of deep and sincere regret everywhere, despite the relatively short 3-year administration of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was marked by outstanding events of world significance." End quote. Well, and one more announcement. In the period from the 22nd to the 26th of April, at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, within the framework of the 4th Russia-Africa Forum, What's Next for the First Forum of Young Diplomats Russia-Africa. This event will bring together young diplomats from Russia and African countries, and will allow discussing topical issues of international cooperation. The forum will be another example of the concept of so-called horizontal diplomacy implemented by the ministry, which is focused on the development of networks platforms for informal communication of young diplomats, government officials, and experts. The key theme is the Forum of Victory Diplomacy, dedicated to the 80th anniversary of the end of the Great Patriotic War. Employees of foreign ministries of foreign affairs and foreign institutions aged from 25 to 40 years, who are in charge of international cooperation in the economic, political, cultural, and humanitarian spheres, as well as those responsible for the development of relations with our country in these areas, have been invited. It is expected that more than 60 diplomats from about 40 countries will take part in the forum. A rich program will be organized for the delegates. Working sessions are planned, including those dedicated to countering neocolonialism, cultural and humanitarian cooperation between Russia and Africa, and, of course, sports diplomacy. On the last day of the forum, an official ceremony of accepting new members will be held. The International Association of Young Diplomats. Let me remind you that it was created on the initiative of the Council of Young Diplomats at the Russian Foreign Ministry in the 17th year in order to strengthen cooperation among the youth activists of the foreign ministries of the world. To date, there are more than 200 diplomats in it, and I am ready to answer your questions. Please, is international life with us?
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna.
Hello.
Recently, it was reported that in the EU countries, in particular, in Germany, in France, a partial return to gas imports from Russia may be considered. And all this is happening against the backdrop of deteriorating relations with the United States. There is a small explanation that the EU is afraid that Washington may use the supply of liquefied natural gas as a trump card in trade negotiations. Here is how you could assess the prospects for resuming cooperation between Russia and the EU in the energy sector.
You know, indeed, we have noticed that this topic pops up in the media. I am referring to the hypothetical possibilities of a return to Russian gas against the backdrop of deteriorating relations between the European Union and the United States. It is necessary to evaluate the EU policy in this direction, based primarily on concrete facts. And of course, what kind of concrete fact is this? These are the steps, the actions of these EU politicians. Let's talk about reality. Brussels has been behaving for a long time as just an unreliable partner in the energy sector. Remember, even before the coup in Ukraine, the European Union took a course to infringe on the interests of Russia as the largest supplier of energy resources. Let's just refresh our memory of what it is about. We started with the adoption of discriminatory legislation, the so-called Third Energy Package, and also continued to conduct massive illegitimate unilateral sanctions that directly affected the fuel and energy complex of our country. This is just one example of such a global one, but I gave one example. Please, over all these years, there have been a huge number of examples and politicized statements of various mechanisms and POSI located on the territory of Western Europe, and some special rapporteurs and foreign ministers, and some anti-Russian gatherings on this score, and endless accusations of Russia, which reliably supplied its own resource to the European Union, in a little whether not politicizing this topic, or using even they then agreed as a weapon. What have we not heard? And, of course, it seems to me that the story of the northern streams, which were first blown up in the center of Western Europe, became such a looped result of this frenzy, and then no one considered it necessary to conduct at least some kind of investigation, let alone transparent, but at least some kind of investigation. Several countries have already withdrawn from these investigations, but Germany is silent, sniffing something like that to itself, muttering under its breath, but does not tell anyone anything. And when Russia proposed to conduct an appropriate investigation under the auspices of the United Nations Secretary General, these same Western countries blocked this proposal. Therefore, and of course I think, in the same chain, ignoring the strikes of the Kiev-Zelensky regime on the objects of the fuel and energy complex, violations of the 30-day moratorium, or call it what you want, the decision on strikes on the infrastructure of the fuel and energy complex. These are all concrete facts. It is necessary to be guided by this. This is a concrete reflection of not just moods, but the depth of their engines, which control this very Brussels bureaucracy. But you know, there is a feeling that the European Union does not intend to stop at these anti-results either. He plans only to increase pressure on the member states of his union, which continue to rely on the supply of Russian energy resources. That is, they have made it worse for themselves. So it is still necessary to make it worse for those who refused to participate in such madness all these years. And in this context, the European Commission is preparing a roadmap for the implementation of the course previously approved in the European Union for the complete rejection of Russian energy carriers. A lot has been written on this subject, and you can read the publications. As we understand it, we are talking about the fact that there will be measures outlined in this document, including those affecting the continued supply of pipeline and liquefied gas from Russia, to shoot themselves wherever possible, and several times. It is clear that it is not in the plans. I mean, the European Union has no plans to increase them. This is obvious. Recently, the representative of the European Commission, Anna-Kaisa Itkinen, said at a briefing in Brussels that the European Union is ready to continue negotiations with the United States and other partners in order to replace the Russian resource. Again, a concrete fact. No one refutes or disavows these statements. Therefore, it is necessary to proceed from this to discuss, therefore, in the current conditions, the possibility of increasing Russian gas supplies to the Ninisovsky market, I think, is a thankless occupation. In any case, Russia has always been, and remains, a reliable exporter of energy resources to world markets. Cooperation in terms of gas supplies with some European countries, I mean the EU countries, continues. In the future, we do not rule out considering various options for interaction in the energy sphere in this direction with some countries, but taking into account our national economic interests. As Sergei Viktorovich used to say, when they get over it, come to their senses, rethink something about themselves, and change their behavior, well, probably then we will discuss this issue with you from a different angle, from a different point of view. For now, we need to proceed from the realities that exist. At the same time, there are also prerequisites that the current leadership of the European Union, or the leadership of a number of European Union member states, will reconsider their position regarding the rejection of Russian energy carriers, leading to stagnation of the European economy and a more radical decline in living standards in the EU countries themselves, because the incomes of ordinary Europeans are falling. There are no such trends at this stage. Revision of EU positions or policies. As for Germany, but it seems to me that this is one of the clearest examples of how a state, its leadership, was able to act against its own country and people, against the background of the Scholz government's initiative and complete rejection of Russian energy carriers, the absence of any reaction, as I have already said, to the undermining of the Nord Stream, the investigation, the absolutely insane closure of nuclear power plants in favor of climate programs, and, of course, under the influence of a new round of transatlantic trade wars. Now, in the very German economy, which for many years and decades was even considered prosperous and literally demonstrating even greater potential, now there is a very difficult situation. You know that businesses are leaving and registering in other countries. Experts are terrified of what is happening in their own country. Against this background, then, you remember, probably a year ago, German journalists came to Moscow to clarify whether Russia could start deliveries along the non-blown, preserved, surviving thread of the northern streams, and received an affirmative answer, even with an indication of the time when it could be done. These German journalists were treated by the German government itself, up to the threat of closing their media outlets. When one of the local German politicians mentioned the prospects of resuming gas supplies from Russia, and with reservations, then, and if, and in the future, and maybe, it was all instantly subjected to harassment and branded Russophobia, and so on and so on. But they have the results.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, whether the tape is with us. Ru.
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna.
Yes, hello.
We have two questions for you. Recently, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Galuzin announced his readiness to restore diplomatic relations with Georgia. How is this issue being discussed with the Georgian side now? Is it possible to talk about real progress on this issue? And what concrete steps does Moscow expect Tbilisi to take on this issue?
It seems to me that, first of all, it would be worth referring to this interview with the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Mr. Galuzin. It talks in detail about this and about this topic. But since the question was raised, I can say that our and departmental authorized persons have repeatedly stated that diplomatic relations between Russia and Georgia were severed, as you know, neither by us nor by the Russian side. They were torn apart by the Saakashvili regime after this regime tried to carry out aggression against the population of South Ossetia, against Russian peacekeepers, respectively, against our citizens. Now in Georgia, the Saakashvili regime is being subjected to the harshest criticism for this, and he himself is under trial, with appropriate decisions. But this is his legacy. It remains, alas, to this day. Last autumn, as part of the election campaign, the Georgian leadership made sound and very promising statements about the need to apologize to the people of South Ossetia. There were statements about the intention to achieve reconciliation. As I understand it, the same attitude is present in official Tbilisi regarding Abkhazia. These are certainly positive signals. We hope that they will be translated into concrete steps to normalize Georgia's relations with Abkhazia and South Ossetia on the basis of such a sincere, deep and analytical understanding of the current realities. We are ready to further comprehensively develop mutually beneficial cooperation with Georgia. There are huge opportunities for this. And for Georgia, Russia remains a key market in many areas, in particular for wine products and fruits. On the other hand, Russia is a leading supplier of grain energy to Georgia. Both Russia and Georgia are united by a common history, culture, religious component, humanitarian ties. All that is called real human ties also have a lot of importance, and guided by the understanding of the historical close ties between our countries, between our peoples, are I don't know how to say it, probably like that. Maybe even with special emotions that permeate our history. And with the understanding of the need to develop comprehensive and mutually beneficial cooperation for the benefit of the two peoples. As you know, the Russian side, based on all of the above, has taken very significant steps in recent years. Direct air communication between Russia and Georgia has been restored. A visa-free regime has been restored for Georgian citizens upon entry. As for diplomatic relations, once again, we are dealing with such a monstrous legacy of a man who, even in his own country, was recognized as an adventurer, and not only within the framework of such a moral and ethical condemnation, but within the framework of the law and with a huge evidence base. But, by the way, we gave the same characterization to the international institutions that were investigating the events of 2008 year. As for diplomatic relations, we are ready to restore them. We are ready to go as far as the Georgian side is ready to go. There are no restrictions for us here. And once again, I urge you to carefully read the interview, the statements that were made by the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, Mr. Gagauzia, will also be duplicated in the text of today's briefing in the form of links to this interview, in fact, which I reproduced close to the text and to you.
Thank you very much, Maria Vladimirovna. And the second question. The High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaya Kols, recently, as is known, warned you member candidates against traveling to Moscow on the 9th of May, and Zelensky invited the leaders of European countries to go to Kiev on this day. To what extent can these statements affect the holding of commemorative events in Moscow, and who, in general, if we know? Should we expect firm representatives of European states in Moscow on Victory Day?
You know, their madness, it seems to me, primarily affects them, because they are already ready to become a laughingstock in front of the whole world in denying history, in rewriting it, in reincarnating the worst that their Western European countries have gone through just to establish themselves on their own current positions, which are based on Russophobia, on anti-Russian endless phobias, on loyalty to these liberal anti-values, the world majority is already laughing at them. Countries that until recently were their colonies. Countries that not so long ago, if we speak by historical standards, received their statehood, laugh at those who call themselves a beautiful garden, civilized, and so on, because everyone knows what the Second World War is, what the Second World War is, what the role of the Soviet Union is, respectively, with our country as the successor of the Soviet Union. What is the role of the Red Army, soldiers of the Soviet armed forces, in the victory over Nazism and fascism? And the world majority looks with disgust at the attempts, in many respects, even of the descendants of the Nazis of that time, who praise and glorify the anti-exploits, in fact the crimes of their ancestors, and are now trying to hastily reinterpret historical facts, replacing them with historical lies. This is the first thing. Therefore, secondly, actually, continuing the answer to this question, this madness is for them first of all, for the countries of the European Union, NATO, the collective West. For them it is destructive. Secondly, we have our own idea of how to hold events within the framework of the 80th anniversary of the victory. Today, I have spoken about many of our political and international political initiatives. We have like-minded people. We have goals and objectives to preserve historical memory, What else can I say? We will certainly continue to debate their fakes, lies. We will do everything to provide the maximum amount of information. Look at how archives are being declassified now, how our department publishes documents previously inaccessible to the general public about individual episodes that shed light on those events. See how many collections, textbooks, feature films, documentaries are being created or even restored bit by bit due to photo and video chronicles of those years. Look at how the works of art related to those years are being reissued. You will see how much attention is paid to public organizations in our country, whether veterans, associations associated with the memory of the blockade, about concentration camp prisoners, what kind of support. Although it is a public organization, the state provides, how it is involved in this work, because it is also the most important stronghold and support of historical memory. Look at how our preschool, school, and higher education is finally starting to open its doors, its programs, so that history finally takes its rightful place, despite other areas of specialization. Important, absolutely necessary, but without knowing your own history, it may be possible to move forward in other directions. But then, unfortunately, mistakes will have to be repeated from previous historical periods. Therefore, probably, if we talk about the impact of what they have come up with and conceived, it is only in strengthening us in our positions and in the fact that we see this as a signal that in no case can these positions be surrendered, that in no case can we trust them again when they promise that we should only slightly weaken our attention to national interests, to our history. So to speak, a rain of prosperity and well-being will fall on us. We've been through this before. As soon as this happens, as soon as we move at least an inch towards forgetting our own history, exactly the opposite happens. Troubles and misfortunes are falling on us. Therefore, if there is any sense in this Western madness, in this frenzy on the topic of the Second World War for us, the Great Patriotic War, it is only in strengthening us in our positions and being a testimony and proof that we have chosen the right path.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Liria Novosti is with us. Yes. Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. Is it heard? Is it seen? Is everything okay? Seen even better than heard. I thought so. Thank you very much. If you will allow Ria Novosti Cristina Luna Rodriguez. We have two today. It's clearly visible that I even found out. It's very nice, Marina Vladimirovna. Thank you. We have two questions today, if possible. The first question. Today you mentioned a difficult discussion at UNESCO on the topic of ensuring the safety of journalists. I would like to know how things are going with the consideration of this problem in other international platforms, such as, for example, the OSCE. And I would also like to know how Moscow assesses the first steps of the newly appointed representative of the Organization for Freedom of the Media, January Bro 2. Are these two questions or one? This is the first question. All right. Indeed, international platforms have become more active in the field of discussing the issues of protecting journalists. It is obvious and understandable why. Because the 3rd of May is the World Press Freedom Day, and there are a lot of conferences, meetings, and a symposium on this subject. Indeed, such discussions are taking place not only in UNESCO now, but also in the OSCE. If, of course, what is happening in the OSCE can be called a discussion. Look, the new representative of the Organization for Freedom of the Media, January Broto. He has just made his debut, one might say, with a profile report. It seems to me that he could see for himself what a heavy legacy he inherited from his predecessor Teresa Ribeiro, who literally ruined this essay. Her extreme bias and absolute inability to resist double standards, and hence incompetence. It seems to me that it just really requires some colossal efforts from the new representative to restore confidence in this institution. Do you understand what's going on? The fact is that since her appointment for at least 4 years, they have literally paralyzed the OSCE's work on this track. After all, it came to the point that the former OSCE representative on freedom of speech, in fact, introduced a norm of conscious disregard for bloody crimes and terrorist attacks against journalists. This is what I mean in this case. I mean the crimes of Kiev regime neo-Nazis against objectionable and, of course, Russian journalists. We talked about this today, too. This is what, for example, in the relevant documents, the agency allegedly promotes international development. I am referring to the American Agency for International Development Assistance, called Strategic Silence. I mean, the predecessor of January Bro Ribera introduced, not just into circulation, but introduced strategic silence into her own, although not her personal, but the OSCE institution. It was just a whole genre of work. They were silent expressively, sometimes loudly silent, sometimes with feeling silent, but silent. Within the framework of the OSCE humanitarian basket, there is not even a hint of any constructive work, constructive dialogue, exchange of views, which does not imply spitting partners, but listening, analyzing, and trying to find common ground. Previously, this very humanitarian basket was aimed at solving common tasks for all and creating appropriate conditions for ensuring the work of media employees on different tracks, including on the security track. But now what's left of it? Where are the concrete results? There is nothing. And the most interesting thing is everything that they tried to criticize Russia for, although Russia did not do it, nor ensuring the safety of journalists' work. Now it has been elevated to the rank of an absolute norm, but I would say a new normality when describing the situation in Ukraine. How can this be? Moreover, the OSCE has stopped stating that Western countries generally do not apply the provisions we signed up for, and even their internal regulations on the protection of journalists, on the protection or on ensuring guarantees of freedom of speech in practice. They keep talking about it, but in practice none of this is used. Moreover, in recent years, they have developed or taken out of some dusty bags new or old reincarnated forms of pressure on dissidents. Content censorship. Moreover, repression and open terror are now being used. What have we not seen? And every time over the past 4 years, under Ribeiro, the OSCE has, as it were, issued an indulgence to Westerners for such behavior. Both the topic of the press and the media employees themselves have become within the OSCE walls in recent years an instrument of political manipulation of the countries of the Western segment, the Western minority, and an instrument of pressure on the state of the world majority, an instrument of manipulation in the interests of their own narrow-minded goals, and objectives. Therefore, January Brit will have to proceed from the understanding that over the past years, there has not just been a landslide collapse of dialogue in this area, but the credibility of the Institute itself has been catastrophically undermined. You see, it's not that journalists have more problems, it's obvious, because right there you have artificial intelligence, with its advantages and threats. Here you have a huge number of armed conflicts. There are off-scale figures of murder, the death of journalists in the performance of their duties. But the main problem for the OSCE is not the number of problems of journalists, but the lack of opportunity to implement its mandate. It's just that the skill is lost. Since the previous one, I mean the predecessor of January Ribeiro fell victim, or unknowingly she just didn't have enough strength. It's up to the professionals to sort it out. But it fell victim to this Western narrow-gauge or narrow-gauge approach when, for the sake of Western conjuncture, all statements about agreements, documents, declarations that the West signed were literally swept off the table, just to push through some one topic they needed. The topic of the day, I would say. But since she could not resist this on her track, then indeed journalists simply do not have confidence in this institution. Moreover, this is not only about Russian journalists, but if you listen to media representatives from other countries, they also do not see any added value. And in general, there are already costs in these OSCE institutions now. Therefore, it is necessary, if there is such a mood, it was said about it, that it is necessary to go exactly by restoring trust. And this can only be done carefully and very adequately performing their functional duties at this place. I would even outline, perhaps, the criteria that need to be implemented in the work of the OSCE Representative Institute for Freedom of Speech. Crystal honesty, integrity, impartiality in the performance of its functionality, without any political preferences, likes or dislikes. I think this is probably close to describing how a doctor or teacher should act. Yes, thank you very much. And the second question, if possible. On April 10th, the head of the EU delegation in Chisinau, Mr. Majakes, said that he did not rule out Russia's interference in the parliamentary elections in Moldova this autumn. Here's how you could comment on it. Thank you. This, it seems to me, is some kind of infection that attacks them all. And until, apparently, they get over it or until they develop a stable intellectual immunity, they will continue to carry it all. If you give an assessment, of course, it's all hypocrisy, it's all lies, it's all manipulation. These are double standards. This is the promotion of fakes. This is a game for the internal audience in order to influence democratic electoral processes. Let me just give you some examples. On the one hand, Russia is being accused without evidence of influencing electoral processes and justice issues in Moldova. We are accused of committing a cyberattack and misinformation. What just wasn't there? At the same time, no facts are given, but they could have presented something in the form of evidence. It's all in the same style as usual. or links to some private information that is impossible to imagine, or, as the same American liberal Democrats told us, by the way, there is everything in social networks. When a couple of years passed, it turned out that they probably hate social networks more than us, and they also began to moderate and censor them. On the other hand, there is open interference by Brussels in the internal affairs of the member states and candidate countries, and associate members of the EU. And Brussels openly demands a revision of the election results. It no longer just requires some political steps from the current authorities, but simply can cancel the election results. If you don't like it, please use a test word from the same region, Romania. This, in general, plunged into shock, turning into Homeric laughter of the entire country, not only the world majority, but also, in particular, the United States of America, which said that they had never seen such a thing, did not even imagine that such a thing could happen. And, as a matter of fact, it was not enough in Moldova when the elections were held. And, of course, this monstrous thing called what is a referendum, Sandu called it. There were such frauds, there were such manipulations, there was such a thing in general. How can this be? That is, when we are accused, there is no evidence, and at the same time, when the West intervenes to the level of moderation in electoral processes, no one sees it. All right, let's take another example. It is alleged, unfounded, that Russia allegedly allocates millions of dollars for bribery. Even the Moldovan voters agreed to this. When the European Union spends millions of dollars on financial support of pro-Western forces in the Republic, both directly, indirectly, and indirectly, as if no one notices anything. By the way, it is also important to see and analyze how financing takes place, because not everything goes in the form of money under the guise of some kind of development assistance. Such a monstrous burden falls on a generation of future Moldovan citizens in the form of loans. In March, the EU Council approved the largest package of financial support for Moldova in the amount of almost 2 billion euros. Of these, out of 1.9 billion euros, 1.5 billion are loans. And this again, as if it does not affect the assessment of the actions of the collective West in relation to Moldova, as interference in internal affairs and so on, such double-entry bookkeeping. Another example claims that Russia poses the main threat to Moldova's security, and in all seriousness, it is said that if Ukraine falls, then Moldova is next in line. But this, you know, is about some kind of proverb. What is brewed, apparently, and the hat burns. Because apparently everything leads to this, then it's necessary to talk about it like that. But in fact, it is Brussels that is doing everything to turn Moldova into an anti-Russian outpost of the European Union and NATO, a logistics base for supplying the Kiev regime. And what does it mean? Drawing Moldova forcibly, against the will of its citizens, into the conflict that is unfolding in neighboring territories. According to the data circulating in the media, Moldova is the second recipient of military aid through the European Peace Fund after the Kiev regime. You understand that we are talking about a fund called the Peace Fund. This is the European War Fund because it finances the war against our country. Here's another proof of how hypocritical it all is. Freedom of speech. But I think that the same Yanis Mazhik, positioning himself as a defender of the independence of the press and civil society, should remember how he again turned on strategic silence and was not indignant when the Moldovan authorities stopped broadcasting not 1, not 5 or even 10, but 18 TV channels, 3 radio stations, and blocked over 60 Russian and Russian-language information resources. The representatives of the European Union did not itch about this. But apparently this is different. There are no double standards. As soon as we are talking about double standards, it means there are no standards at all. And here we come to the following conclusion. So it's all engagement. By the way, Mr. Mosheiko has repeatedly blurted out the true reasons for the so-called care or guardianship of Chisinau. In September of the 24th year, on the eve of the elections of the President of Moldova, on the eve of a memorable referendum, a pseudo-referendum on the country's accession to the European Union, as one of the consequences of the implementation of the European project, he mentioned, and we talked about it then, the possibility of buying agricultural land in Moldova with Western TNC's multinational companies. Remember how then it literally blew up the information space in Moldova? What effect did it all cause? What was done then? By the way, even the local authorities, who should guard the interests of their citizens, pretended that nothing had happened, nothing had been said. But we understand perfectly well that he just really voiced the true goals of his association in relation to Moldova. Here is probably another detail to complete the review of this whole situation. December of the 24th year. At that time, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service reported that according to available information, it was Yanis Magics who presented the Moldovan side with demands to criminalize the leaders of a number of opposition political formations, including those advocating a mutually beneficial dialogue with Russia under any pretext, and also to remove from office again the head of Gagauzia, Evgenia Hutzel. It's just across their throats. They just don't know what to do with it anymore. In March, as we have talked about it, and talked about it today, in March, she was detained at the Chisinau airport. Now he is under house arrest. Here, please, is the democracy in practice, directly on the example of Moldova. Therefore, all this should be taken into account by the citizens of Moldova. It seems to me that this is already a generally recognized fact, and the calling card of Brussels in every sense is the rapid change of favorites and the oblivion of those promises that were generously distributed when it was necessary. Therefore, unfortunately, they have not gone away from this tactic, they are actively using it. I would like to hope that they will not go further in destroying Moldova, its statehood, its culture. But at the same time, we need to be realistic. Thank you very much. Thank you. Whether Artie Balkan is with us. Yes, good afternoon. Yes, hello. I can't hear you. Just a second. Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. Good afternoon. Not heard. Yes, yes, yes. We have the first one today. What are Moscow's expectations from the new Serbian government, in which, after criticism of the European Union, there is no Alexander Warrior? And I will ask the second one after your answer. Thank you. But it seems to me that this is a great occasion for representatives of the European Union, including those we have just talked about, their colleagues, to express a strong protest to themselves in connection with interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state, in particular Serbia. This is the first thing. Secondly, I think I will say what you know. We will build mutually beneficial cooperation with this country in the spirit of traditionally friendly partnership relations in the interests of our peoples. And why? And why does Brussels interfere in domestic politics, in internal affairs, even reaching the formation of cabinets in the Serbian government? This question should not be asked to us, not in Moscow. And we have one more question. How are the negotiations going? What do they depend on? from signing a new gas agreement between Serbia and Russia, given that the current one expires on the 31st of May. As you know, contacts under the new contract for the supply of Russian natural gas to Serbia are carried out by the competent structures of the two countries. I can check with them if you give me a list of more specific questions. And then it will be easier for us to redirect your question to experts, and then we will also give you this answer. Thank you very much. Thank you. Listen, Hua is with us.
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna.
Hello.
Correspondent Sim. We have such a question for you today. Recently, a central meeting of the leaders of the relations of neighboring countries with China was held in Beijing. It was noted that in order to build a community of separate destiny with these countries, China is ready to cooperate in various spheres. In various spheres, for example, strengthening strategic mutual trust, creating a high-level network of interconnectedness. Joint, ensuring regional stability, expanding contacts and exchanges, ensuring the convenience of people's movement, and so on. How would you comment on this? How do you think Russia and China, which are the largest neighbors from each other, should cooperate in order to maintain peace and development in the region and around the world? Thank you.
You correctly said that Russia and China are the largest neighboring countries. I will only add that the relations between our countries represent an exemplary model of equal and mutually beneficial, respectful, friendly cooperation of the great powers in the modern world. I would also add those who are responsible for their role in international relations. The top leaders of our countries have shown political wisdom, putting an end to the once very sensitive, as for any state, border issue, turning it into a belt, as your experts and ours say, a belt of eternal peace and friendship, passed down from generation to generation. It's a beautiful phrase, but I think it really contains such real wisdom. The regions of the Russian Far East and the northeast of the People's Republic of China are connected by numerous ties of practical cooperation, humanitarian exchanges. In order to promote development in this area, such structures as the relevant Intergovernmental Commission are being created and are successfully functioning. A set of measures is being implemented to further develop and expand contacts, including mutual trips of citizens, and our visa experts are working. I often comment on this. I am sure that in terms of cross-border cooperation, Russia and China set an excellent example of good neighborliness. It does not mean at all that there are no issues that need to be resolved. The only question is that we are ready to solve them and do it on a mutually respectful basis. The Russian Federation maintains close partnership relations with all states that directly border China and maintain the ties that were the subject of the meeting you mentioned. What else can I say in response to your question? It is probably worth noting the coordinated work that is being carried out on bilateral tracks within the framework of international structures, that is, not only in a bilateral format, but also, for example, on the SCO platform, on the platform of the Session Dialogue, in other trilateral formats. Our countries are interested in ensuring the security and stability of all our neighbors in the region. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that this is one of the goals and objectives of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in the creation of which Moscow and Beijing played a special role. Our countries are ready to assist the progressive socio-economic development of their neighbors, countries, and the region. And at the same time, we do not accept destructive interference outside of regional players, outside of regional forces, especially those pursuing an anti-Russian, anti-Chinese goal, task, or strategy by implementing We also have a jointly developed approach to regional issues in a number of areas, not only in general political, but also in economic terms, and in terms of countering new challenges and threats. In other words, we are developing such practical actions in a number of areas. And it seems to me that there is another important area of our interaction in a broader sense. Cooperation between Moscow and Beijing contributes to the consolidation of the countries of the global South and East, which are already tired of the endless dominance of the West, which already looks like some kind of eternal colonial idea fix, which want to rely, again, I repeat this word, on a mutually respectful relationship. They want to interact on an equal basis, and in this sense, the role of our countries, in my opinion, is invaluable. And indeed, so much is being said about the need, not even about the statement of the formation of a new world. And our two countries, our two states, are contributing to the formation of a more just multipolar world order, as an alternative to the endless dictate by only a narrow group of countries of the world minority or individual countries that consider themselves constantly exceptional and consider it possible to dictate their will to others.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. With us, Lee. Reuters.
Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon.
Hello.
Reuter is here. We have a question that.
You used to be with us, and now you're just here.
And here and with you.
All right. You see, I remember everything.
Well, I wanted to diversify the greeting.
And I'm for tradition, you know.
The issue is related to a recent interview with Foreign Minister Sergei Viktorovich Lavrov to the Kommersant newspaper, in which he said that it is not easy to agree on the key components of the settlement around Ukraine, and they are being discussed. Could you clarify what the essence of the disagreement is? To what extent are the principles of settlement, which were set out by President Putin on June 14th of last year, acceptable to the United States? And, accordingly, what does the American side offer?
It seems to me that you have a little bit of a patchwork quilt. So you started by asking what the essence of the disagreements is. Why are the settlement parameters not just being discussed? Don't you hear and see what we talk about literally every day? Even without touching on the global topic of the root causes, the elimination of which is necessary, but even now, on the local track, of agreements on a 30-day moratorium on strikes on fuel and energy facilities. The Kiev regime's incompetence is obvious. I can't say this, everything rests on it. I say again, the topic is boundless. It was in an interview with the Kommersant newspaper that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov elaborated on this in detail, but even this one component suggests that, with all the complexity of the history of the issue, with all the madness that was going on this track, as we talked about today, on the part of the West, which literally manually forged a young democracy on Ukrainian soil. But without this key component, or on the example of this key component, it becomes clear what, as you said, is the complexity and difficulty of working out the parameters of agreements. You are talking about the parameters of the agreement, and the Kiev regime is demonstrating non-negotiability. And there is no denying it. Even if you can't, or even if, and if you allow yourself to just isolate this particular episode, you will understand that this is, of course, a colossal problem. Let me remind you, after all, literally after the statements of Washington and Moscow about the proposal of a moratorium on strikes on fuel and energy facilities, Zelensky supported this idea. He supported it not as a third-party proposal, but as an opportunity for his own participation, for Ukraine's participation. He did not just stand in solidarity with her, he became part of this moratorium. Well, at least there was a day when they would have done what, well, relatively speaking, they signed up for. It wasn't a signature, but it was the statement of a man who constantly insists that he is in charge of everything in Ukraine. Do you understand? 30 days cannot withstand what the world community has been publicly assured of. For 30 days it was just necessary to hold out and not do what, again, they promised not to do. Well, it's just, I say it again, one of the most important examples of the fact that any parameters that will be worked out in the context of possible future agreements must be fulfilled by the parties. And in this case, the Kiev regime once again demonstrates absolute incompetence. And they demonstrated it before, but earlier, as has already been said and announced, they deceived the world community by talking about the desire or intention to fulfill the Minsk agreements, and now they have declared that they participate in the declared moratorium and at the same time do not hide that they do not participate. What are we talking about? Now about the second part of your question, about Washington. It seems to me that Washington still has its own official representatives, its commentators, its experts, who can say a word for the official authorities and add something on their own behalf. Therefore, it is better to go there with these questions. But let me briefly answer that we are now at this stage. I mean, the whole world is dealing with the new administration. This is a different administration in all respects, if we compare it with the previous one. Unlike its predecessors, as it stated, it does not rely on the imposed judgments of globalists or experts engaged by them. This administration, again, judging by the statements that have been made repeatedly, is trying to figure out the details, the essence of the problem itself. For what? In order to develop your own opinion about the situation and about possible ways to solve it. These statements were made by President Trump, representatives of his administration, and directly by those appointed by him as representatives, as commissioners for international contacts, in the context of the Ukrainian crisis. I want to say settlement, but for now we are talking about a crisis. All this requires patience, time, and, of course, a thorough, verified approach based on the study of facts. We see how the current administration is demonstrating the spirit to achieve the goal I have just mentioned. But of course now we are only at the beginning of the road. So far, the first steps are being taken only on this path. We talk about where there is success and, frankly, and in sufficient detail, inform the public, the media. We also do not hide where the problematic nodal issues remain, where they have not even begun to be considered yet. Again, I will return you to Sergei Lavrov's interview with Kommersant and to his other speeches and statements on this subject. We will make links, repeat them in the text of the briefing. We continue trusting contacts with the American side. We see that they hear us on a number of important issues. We believe that on the basis of the information provided, certain aspects have become better understood by them. They began to understand better our arguments about the lack of alternative to eliminating the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. What you asked about in your question, what Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke about being directly in this hall on June 14th, 2024 year. First of all, we are talking about attempts to eradicate all Russian, to destroy the Russian-speaking population, about a military plan to involve Ukraine in NATO for its settlement.
Thank you very much for your reply.
Thank you. Is the Media Corporation of China with us? Yes. Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. We are with you. We have two questions today. As we recall, the United States recently introduced import duties for almost all countries of the world. Further, more than 75 countries were given a 90-day delay. At first, smartphones, computers, and other electronic devices were exempted from duties, and even later, the US Secretary of Commerce said that it was all temporary, and that allegedly in 1 or 2 months, such goods would also fall under new duties. In your opinion, what are the underlying reasons for such fluctuations in the tariff policy of the state? Well, I can say it in 2 words. No, if I say they, it will be 3 words. I promised 2. They knock out preferences. They don't even hide that. It's just that every time they talk about it at past briefings, they do it in their own way. Each new administration, or some teams that replace each other. In this case, they do it like this. In Washington, as a matter of fact, I repeat once again, they do not hide that they no longer consider themselves bound by international obligations. They no longer consider themselves bound by trade law. They are not bound, as they themselves declare, by obligations within the World Trade Organization. They preferred unilateral tariff protectionism. And it is precisely due to this protectionism that they apparently expect to improve the conditions for access of American companies to foreign markets. Apparently, they expect to attract investments in this way, to transfer large-scale production to their territory. This all follows from their official statements and explanations. And the tariff barrier is essentially being used by the White House to force trading partners to accept American conditions. Again, we return to these 2 words, knockout preferences. Any shocks to the global economy that threaten to slow down its growth and a general decline in consumption. Obviously, at this stage, they will not influence the world processes in the best way. Russia is a major exporter and a responsible participant in the multilateral trading system. Our country is interested in honest, open trade relations. Again, an honest, equal competitor. What does equal mean? This does not mean that everyone has the same opportunities. Obviously, they are all different, but everyone should have the same rules, since everyone is a participant in a single space, in which it is necessary to interact with each other in a civilized way in some way. And moreover, these rules for this common space have already been worked out, and no one has officially refused them before. Accordingly, our country opposes the use of any unilateral restrictions on trade, such as illegitimate sanctions, politicized, posed as environmental, climate requirements, and other methods of unfair competition that negatively affect global trade, run counter to the obligations that were voluntarily assumed within the framework of relevant structures and organizations. In other words, there is nothing illegal for a country to say that it is withdrawing from some international structure in accordance with the existing procedures and obligations assumed. Then it is necessary to withdraw from this organization, but to preserve preferences for oneself while being in the organization, but at the same time declare that membership in this organization does not entail any responsibility and obligations, and the country is not bound by anything. But it's weird. That is, either full membership, which includes opportunities, duties, rights, and responsibilities, or then it is already necessary to officially declare that they are not members, in particular of the TOE. If so, thank you, yes, thank you. If you have finished the second question. The 5th anniversary Beijing Film Festival starts tomorrow. They will show the Russian prophet Felix Umarov about Alexander Pushkin. In parallel, meanwhile, the 47th Moscow International Film Festival is already starting. There will be shown as many as 27 Chinese films. In your opinion, what contributed to the success of the Chinese film industry in Russia? And how does cultural exchange at film festivals affect the development of cinema in Russia and China in general? It seems to me that our bilateral cooperation in the field of cinematography is an important component of the multifaceted Russian-Chinese complex of bilateral relations. And historically, not only now, our cinema has always been known and loved in China. Well, of course, with some interruptions, with some sinusoids, but our films, our actors, were widely represented on the Chinese market. Now our audience is watching Chinese films with interest. Moreover, we watched and learned, and knew Chinese directors and actors before. Now we are talking about such bilateral exchanges, or even the creation of joint projects. And of course, this direction is in the focus of attention of the leaders of our countries, just so that our people who live in Russia and China get to know each other better, based on the fact that we are two of the largest neighbors for each other. Last year, on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Kazan, the heads of state separately touched upon the development of joint film production, and in order to implement the agreements reached through the relevant departments of Russia and China, systematic work is currently underway to further expand and saturate the profile exchanges with new content. In March, just a month ago, a representative of the delegation of domestic filmmakers, headed by the Minister of Culture of Russia Olga Lyubimova, and posted China. A roundtable was held there with the participation of specialists from the two countries. Presentations of new creative projects were organized. Russian representatives were able to visit major local film studios. As part of the negotiations, the parties agreed on an action plan for joint film production, as we expect, and in general, in principle. This plan is expected to be signed in the near future. I think that the relevant department will probably be able to tell you more about this, but we are sure that there are huge prospects for increasing cooperation in this area. I repeat once again, we have excellent examples of such interaction in our history. And I think the prospects are even more ambitious. Here, for example, is Red Silk. This is the premiere of a Russian-Chinese film. It took place in February, and I think it really was a real success. Another example is the annual film festivals that arouse really genuine interest in our two countries. Russian and Chinese films participate in various festivals, both on a bilateral basis and in international film festivals. We are really very pleased with the success of the domestic film The Prophet, the story of Alexander Pushkin, and we wish the director and the team of the entire film and the entire crew good luck at the upcoming 15th Beijing International Film Festival. And of course, we are expecting screenings of Chinese films in Moscow. April is always rich in movie events, so we wish you all a pleasant viewing. We will keep an eye on new products. At the state level, a powerful start has been given to the upcoming work. Thank you. Thank you. With us, La News.ru.
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna.
Hello.
Armenian Foreign Minister Ararat Mirzoyan said this week that Yerevan, Baku and Ankara have never been as close to peace as they are today. He also put forward several proposals to unblock communications in the region. In turn, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov once again called for the implementation of the entire complex of agreements between Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia in the 2020 and 22nd years, including the unblocking of communications. How could Moscow contribute to the implementation of these agreements at the moment?
As you know, the set of agreements at the highest level, which you have just mentioned, remains fully relevant. We repeat this, in my opinion, every week, answering questions. The early resumption of full-fledged cooperation in a unilateral format, of course, would contribute to the establishment of sustainable peace and prosperity in the South Caucasus. And, of course, we are ready to assist Azerbaijani and Armenian partners in all key areas, reconciliation of the two countries. We have excellent practices on unblocking transport and economic communications within the framework of a specialized trilateral working group co-chaired by the Deputy Prime Ministers of Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. We are ready to share our experience in the delimitation and demarcation of the border, and our specialists in this field, it seems to me, they are recognized as one of the best in the post-Soviet space. We also have unique cartographic material. We can also help in resolving the humanitarian issues that have accumulated over the years of the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. We will be only too glad, but I say again, I won't say anything new. We are always happy to help our Azerbaijani and Armenian friends advance the process of normalization of relations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. With us, Lee Balt News. Hello. Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. You have already really answered my question about the right slope to buy ships, so thank you. Lyle Maiden is with us. So then we'll come back later. With us or Ku TV? Yes, with you. Yes, hello. Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. We have one question today. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, speaking in Parliament on Tuesday, called for the dissolution of the OBSE Minsk Group in accordance with the Azerbaijani side's demand. How does Moscow perceive the readiness of the Armenian leader? And what else, in your opinion, should be done as soon as possible in order to sign a peace treaty? You know, I'll just remind you, we have repeatedly said that with the termination of communication with the Russian co-chair by the American and French co-chairs of the Minsk Group, and this happened in February of the 22nd year, as well as with the recognition of Karabakh by Armenia as an integral part of the Republic of Azerbaijan, following the results of the Armenia-Azerbaijan European Union-France summit in Prague, and it was the 6th of October, 2022nd year, also a radical change in the situation on Earth. But again, if we talk in the autumn of 2023 year, this very approved Manit of the OBSE Minsk Conference co-chair on the Nagorno-Karabakh settlement has lost its relevance. We have dwelt on this topic many times. Accordingly, as a consequence, all the structures of the Minsk Conference are the Minsk Group, the high-level planning group, and the post of personal representative of the OSCE chairman in office on the Nagorno-Karabakh regulation. All of this is subject to dissolution. We believe that the best way to make an appropriate decision is a joint proposal of Baku and Yerevan on the liquidation of these institutions. For our part, we intend to continue to assist our partners in overcoming the remaining obstacles to signing a peace treaty and in unblocking transport and economic communications, delimiting the Armenian-Azerbaijani state border, and resolving humanitarian issues. Everything I have just said is based on a set of trilateral agreements at the highest level that were concluded in the period from the 20th to the 22nd years. And of course, we always confirm our readiness to provide a Russian platform for negotiations between representatives of Azerbaijan and Armenia on the entire spectrum of bilateral issues, including the conclusion of a peace treaty. Thank you very much. Thank you. Post. Yes, hello. We have one question today, but it's quite voluminous. Yulia Zhdanova, acting head of the Russian delegation to the Vienna talks on military security and arms control, said that the Western coalition, which supports the Kiev Nazis worldwide, includes about 50 states. It is very difficult to build constructive discussions with this group at the OSCE Forum on Security Cooperation, she said. Is it necessary to do this? What do you see as the usefulness of this forum? And how do you assess the current state of the process launched in Helsinki during the Soviet era and largely influenced by the results of the Second World War? As you know, after the activities of the NATO-Russia Council were curtailed on the initiative of Western representatives, the Forum on Security Cooperation actually remained the only channel of multilateral military political contacts between our country and the so-called collective West. But there is a very important nuance. The fact is that the work at the forum is conducted with the equal participation of all participating states without exception, and on the basis of the core principle of consensus for the OSCE. This means that no one can impose an unacceptable decision on Russia, as well as on any other state, or, for example, simply ignore its opinion. Last year, the Danish chairmanship of the forum, of course, on this very wave of Russophobia, tried to violate this principle, but this attempt was crossed by our country. But we have to really state that the remilitarization of the western part of Europe and this aggressive policy, which is being imposed on the public consciousness in the countries of NATO and the European Union, has the most negative impact on the forum and its work. We see how Westerners are throwing considerable efforts to, for example, prevent the implementation of the mandate of this organization. And at the heart of the mandate, let me remind you again, is the task of strengthening security and stability through negotiations on specific confidence-building measures. And what do we see in practice? We see how, in practice, Western Europe is moving in a diametrically opposite direction, as militarization, the destruction of trust, the collapse of the remnants of mechanisms that guarantee security. This is a process that simply leads to the abyss. In addition, the French, Canadians, Poles, Balts, and other radicals seek to use the forum as a platform for a hybrid confrontation with our country. This is also disinformation. These are different techniques that they use. We dissuade such approaches. We use this platform to disseminate information based on facts, on reliable information. For 3 years at the OSCE Forum, we have presented about 100 reports on the real situation in the zone of a special military operation, war crimes of the Kiev regime with the assistance of its Western patrons, including in the Kursk region. We force opponents to open their eyes and see the truth, no matter how unpleasant. Maybe, I do not know, it would not be pleasant for them, because it seems to me that many people in Western Europe really suffer from perversions. We see how the mass media, even their own, are being silenced inside the countries of the European Union. There are no alternative sources of information either. Only one NATO mainstream with officialdom. We have repeatedly spoken about the deepest crisis that the OSCE itself is currently experiencing. Let me remind you of the speech of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov at the Foreign Ministry of this organization just recently. The current state of affairs in the organization is due to such a maniacal, obsessive desire of the countries of the Western camp to subordinate this Vienna platform to their own interests, to use as a tool, as some such element of pseudo-privatized and used for pressure. What have we not already seen from them as part of the implementation of this obsession? But, of course, the worst thing is that we are witnessing not only some kind of political conjuncture, not only a departure from the OSCE principles, not only disrespect for the basic mechanisms underlying this organization, but we are observing the processes on the OSCE platform, for which it was created to counteract. And scary to see the growth of neo-Nazi sentiments, the glorification of Nazism. In the West, they are trying with might and main to revise the results of the Second World War, to reduce the decisive contribution of our country to victory, to whitewash Nazi criminals, and the OSCE not only cannot counteract this, but it turns out by its inaction, or does not prevent pouring water on the mill of those who are engaged in this obscurantism. The tragic lessons of history in the West do not want to remember, as much as we have talked about it, even today, and until the NATO and EU countries give up their geopolitical games, the OSCE and the Helsinki process is based on it. In fact, these are the principles that the international community came to after the Second World War for us, the Great Patriotic War. So, as long as all this does not start working at full capacity, as prescribed by this structure, the organization will have no future. Here it is important not only to keep it in shape, but most importantly, so that its content begins to heal. Thank you, is the messenger of the Caucasus with us.
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna.
Hello.
French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot this week expressed hope for the expansion of the EU mission in Armenia, which, according to him, observes and eases tensions in the South Caucasus. How does the Russian Foreign Ministry assess France's activity in the South Caucasus as a whole, and Paris' support for the work of the EU mission in Armenia?
You know, we have also spoken on this topic regularly. There is every reason to believe that the Europeans, especially the French, are interested in maintaining regional tensions in order to achieve their own geopolitical goals. We have absolutely no illusions about. They are trying to assure us of good intentions in Paris, in the South Caucasus. And indeed, the agenda in the region has nothing to do with the process of de-escalation, normalization of peace, construction, creativity, and so on. No, we have repeatedly witnessed the attempts of the Yesayan Palace to impose mediation efforts at the cost of aggravating the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict and contradictions. It is the French who bear a significant share of responsibility for the sabotage of the work and the actual collapse of the OBSE Minsk Group in 2000. We are absolutely well aware of the true goals of the European Union in Armenia. They have absolutely nothing to do with the tasks of promoting normalization of relations between Baku and Yerevan. They can be called, representatives of the European Union, such spy monitors, and they work both internally and externally against all the neighboring states and countries of Armenia. This was noted by many regional players. Moreover, the information that Paris representatives collect while in the region, they do not share with their Armenian colleagues in any way, because the goal is different. They're sending everything straight to Brussels. For what? It seems to me that no one is hiding the task of Brussels in the post-Soviet space. This is endless chaos, discord, pitting. Moreover, as we understand it, the ideas of the European Union and France are at the center of their thoughts. To expand the range of tasks for the mission. For what? Again, in order to get through to the South Caucasus by hook or by crook, to gain a foothold on Earth, so that not regional players, not neighboring countries, not member countries of regional associations decide their own issues and fate. Moreover, there is already experience and, in general, quite good developments. And in order to dictate there will from the outside. Yes, they are not called the NATO mission, and they are not called the headquarters or the representation of the NATO headquarters. But it's strange how NATO. Of course, they do not bring any stability to the observer region. We are recording reports of shooting in the Armenian-Azerbaijani border area, and this is another confirmation that activity outside the regionals, be it the European Union or France, clearly does not bring the South Caucasus closer to peace and prosperity. On the contrary, it creates new dividing lines, new hotbeds of tension, new problems in it. The election of external partners and the parameters of ensuring national security is, of course, the sovereign right of any state. In particular, we are talking about Armenia, but it seems to me that everyone also understands that the South Caucasus is viewed by the European Union primarily as another front of the hybrid war they are unleashing. Now it's global. If earlier they only acted against Russia, now you look at what is happening. And it seems to me that by dragging Armenia into the orbit of the collective West with vague and, as always, deceptive prospects, France seeks to undermine the centuries-old Russian-Armenian relations, which have always worked in favor of the peoples of our one country, then our two countries. Does such a mission of France and the European Union meet the aspirations, tasks, and interests of the Armenian people? And I say again, if we speak by our proper names, NATO, of course not. They don't get anything constructive, positive, or profitable from this, and they won't get anything. Why? There is a test word. Because nobody got anything good from NATO.
Thank you very much.
So with us laziness front. Yes, hello. One question, if I may. The likely future German Chancellor Friedrich Merz called on the Kiev regime to change its strategy in the conflict with Russia by going on the offensive, and as one of the key goals for the uproar, he pointed out the Crimea in an interview with the Hey Arty TV channel. How does the Russian Foreign Ministry regard such a statement and incitement to strikes on Crimea by representatives of Germany? Well, it's just crazy to hear such statements. If it could have been a year ago, I would have said it was crazy, because it is immoral, because it is associated with some kind of terrorist logic, because this is undisguised extremism, because it's all connected with, again, stepping on the old rake. Now I'll say it differently. Despite the fact that the above factors remain, well, how can you demand some kind of offensive from the citizens of Ukraine? Everyone has already understood everything about the plight of the AFU and all their battalions and so on. That is why they are fiercely hitting citizens, civilian infrastructure, peaceful people. Because everything has already been used, all the options with some counterattacks, and led to the mass death of Ukrainian citizens forcibly mobilized by Zelensky into this meat grinder. And against this background, one of the main sponsors of the slaughter and destruction of the Slavs of our region, a representative of Germany, comes out. I mean, Germany is one of the main sponsors. Historically, by the way, unfortunately, when such madmen come to power, and again, he begins to whip this half-dead horse, forcing it to get up somewhere and go on the attack. What kind of attack? In what offensive? Look at the captured representatives of the armed forces of Ukraine. You look, first of all, our people treat them, feed them, poet, and then they themselves tell how they were treated like cattle inside their own armed forces of Ukraine. What offensive? You know, I think it would be useful for the CDU leader to understand the following. And since it is impossible to fire these cruise missiles without the direct help of the Bundeswehr military personnel, they strike at any Russian objects of critical transport infrastructure, and as a target, as you probably noticed, the mark confidently designated the Crimean Bridge. You said that. So all this will be regarded as the direct participation of Germany in the fighting on the side of the Kiev regime, with all the ensuing consequences for Germany, although it seems to me that conditionally we are talking on the side of the Kiev regime, because the Kiev regime is not a party, but a tool in this Western manipulation. So, is the voice of the fatherland with us?
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna, we are with you.
Yes, hello.
Hello. We have heard your answer to the question of colleagues about the interview with Sergei Viktorovich Lavrov, where he said that Russia and the United States have not yet agreed on key parameters for a settlement in Ukraine. But we would like to continue the discussion in one more way and note that it is impossible to agree on these parameters before the court decision in Russia on revoking the recognition of Ukraine's independence. In other words, the process of peace negotiations is coming to an impasse. How do you see the further development of the situation in this context?
You know, I'm going to start with your first sentence. We are not aware that anyone has ever appealed to the court with a request to revoke the recognition of the independence of the former Soviet republics, and this would have some judicial consequences in the form of a process that has started. Accordingly, the rest of the question is simply irrelevant.
But there is a court, a lawsuit.
Is there a court?
600. No, there is a lawsuit that involved more than 600,000 residents of our fatherland.
You were talking about the trial. Has the trial started?
That's the thing, it didn't start.
Accordingly, I can't answer the next part of your question in any way. You link it with the court.
All right.
Thank you. Is the author and with us?
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. Yes, Ruslan Pankratiev is the author, and we are with you. You have already answered the first question, quite broadly, voluminously. I mean the threats of Kai Kallas. There's something bubbling in her head all the time. I don't know what to expect next, but the next news is no less shocking. We would like to receive your comment. The Apostolic Nuncio of the Vatican in Ukraine, Archbishop Viskulbakas, said, I quote, on April 13th, Russian troops shelled the city of Sumy. Palm Sunday, and in the Ukrainian city of Sumy, people, apparently of different faiths, went to their churches to pray. As a result of rocket fire, more than 30 people were killed at the very moment when they were going to pray, because the strike fell on the very center of the city. End quote. Well, we know perfectly well that the strike was carried out precisely at a military facility, where at least 30 mercenaries and foreign instructors were killed. How could you comment on this? Because the so-called Holy See and the papal media are actively participating, I would say, in this propaganda campaign on the part of Ukraine, and are setting up this anti-Russian agenda.
Well, you, as a matter of fact, anticipated the response of the phrase that the Ministry of Defense has already made a statement, and you are officially familiar with it, that on April 13th, the Russian army launched a missile strike at the gathering place of the command staff of the Operational Tactical Group of the Armed Forces of Ukraine Seversk in the city of Sumy. Dozens of servicemen and officers of the Armed Forces of Ukraine were liquidated. You can also look at the specific figures announced by the Defense Ministry of the Russian Federation. I also said today that everything we heard from Westerners and the officials of international structures lobbied by them in this regard. Immediately after Russia was struck, this is another production. This is another staged informational operetta, the main components of which are lies, hypocrisy, a perversion of reality. Naturally, this is not the first time we have seen this. All this is said contrary to common sense, not to mention the absence of any moral values. Again, civilians continue to be used, first, as a human shield for Zelensky and his subordinates. Then, they begin to be used as a false factor to accuse our country. But it's constant. We have been observing it from year to year, and not only since the 22nd year, and before that. At the same time, real facts, such as the fact that the West proposed to rely on, when assessing the second Ukrainian maiden of 2014 year, who opened fire on peaceful demonstrators, is not taken into account. Despite the statement of the EU members that, of course, they were snipers from the Kiev regime. But the main thing is different. The main thing is that within Ukrainian society, as I have already said, regardless of political views and preferences, it was after this monstrous crime of Zelensky and this whole junta that an active discussion began on how this is even possible. Who is responsible for this? Who plan to use civilians, women and children, in order to obviously create another staging and present this production with the accusation of Russia, including, and probably first of all, to Washington, as allegedly factual material against Russia. And then, as usual, an untranslatable wordplay. And you can see what a fierce controversy has unfolded in Ukrainian society now. People are really looking for the culprits. They want to know the answers to their questions. How did it happen that in the center of a densely populated city, the Orthodox Palm Sunday holiday was organized, with the participation of a large number of military personnel? They are asking this question. And why? I'm not sure that women and children were invited to these events. I think they were seconded. People are starting to ask a question. The recent statements of the apostolic announcement in Ukraine, which you mentioned, his figure is characterized by a frankly biased character. We already know that. They can only cause confusion and regret, taking into account the generally balanced official line of the Holy See and Pope Francis personally, who has repeatedly demonstrated an understanding of the root causes of the current conflict and expressed readiness to contribute in every possible way to the settlement, and precisely by political and diplomatic means, and not to inflame and worsen the situation. Look, just recently, a telephone conversation took place between the heads of the foreign ministries of Russia and the Vatican. During this conversation, of course, the Ukrainian crisis was also discussed, as well as the prospects for its resolution, based on the well-known approaches of the Russian Federation. Mutual interest in continuing a constructive dialogue was confirmed, and instead of making biased and unfounded statements, which, as I understand it, simply go against the line of the Vatican, And all this is done for the sake of the momentary political conjuncture. This very Kulbokas would need to focus his efforts on really important tasks that truly correspond to his diplomatic mission in Kiev. Well, for example, it's not my job to teach him. I think he has curators who will tell him how to work from the official Vatican. But in principle, if he climbs to us with his opinion, it's a very good reason to return it all to him, really, in the form of recommendations. He could have contributed to the educational work with the Ukrainian authorities in order to convince them to observe a moratorium on strikes on fuel and energy complex facilities, which Zelensky signed up for. New verbally stated that he remains committed to this moratorium. Well, for example, to work with the Kiev regime so that it stops daily massive attacks on civilian objects on the territory of Russia. Well, for example, to reach out to the Kiev regime so that someone cancels the legislative ban imposed by Ukraine on negotiations with Russia. I think there is another area of activity that directly relates to the sphere or competence of the papal nuncio in Ukraine. This is the absolutely overwhelming cynicism with which the Kiev regime attacks and destroys the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This is where a representative of a Christian denomination, a Christian family, could find a use for himself. He sees with his own eyes how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is being destroyed, how parishes are being destroyed, how parishioners are not just suffering morally, but how they are subjected to physical violence, including repression, and murder too. How is the desecration of the shrines of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and therefore of all Christianity, taking place before the eyes of the world community? But for some reason, this person is not interested. I listed what he could do in his free time, and not in his free time, by the way, too.
Thank you very much.
Whether the EV magazine is with us to conduct. So, probably not with us. And then, I will clarify whether Almaden is with us. If not, then we will respond to the received questions in a targeted manner. Maria Vladimirovna. Hello. Natalia Gaponenko. Cultural and political magazines and news. Yes, I would like to. Yes, to continue the Christian theme a little, but suddenly to be transported to another region. Since the conflict is currently being waged in the Middle East, our readers and a public organization concerned about the fate of the horsefly. And I would like to ask you about fate. What is happening there? How great are the risks? What is the situation there now? You know, military, the aggravation of the military-political situation in a number of countries of the Middle East, and, above all, the sharp escalation in the zone of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, along with the aggravated socio-economic problems, of course, negatively affects the situation of various ethno-confessional groups living in this region, including the Christian community. It is not a small number. There are many people who profess Christianity, and of course, the situation in the Holy Land, where most of the Orthodox shrines of the Middle East are located, is of particular concern. We are talking about the territories of Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church maintain close contacts with local authorities, with the leadership of Christian denominations, in order to provide the necessary support to the Christian population of the Middle East, including in the restoration of churches, educational institutions, religious sites damaged during the hostilities, significant assistance, and it is multifaceted. to the Middle East Christians are supported by the Imperial Orthodox Palestinian Society and the Foundation for the Support of Christian Culture and Heritage established by the Rosatom State Corporation. Other Russian non-governmental organizations, religious and cultural associations are actively working in this direction to restore and improve the Orthodox heritage sites of Jerusalem, and much, much more. And, of course, our caring citizens send humanitarian aid and financially support it, of course, morally, and they pray. Thank you very much. Thank you. Just in case, I will clarify. Alma is not one with us. If not, it's okay. Then we will respond in a targeted manner. Thank you very much. Then, until the next time, and well-being.